Welcome everybody to the third session of the Super Summer Session A-GaMEs. We are going to be talking about bridging the gap today, or communicating subsurface conditions for construction. And I'm going to share my screen here. And we'll get started here. So thank you for everybody attending. We've got a great lineup today. Again, we're talking about bridging the gap today in the third session of this A-GaME series. So we started this series of sessions out talking about stepping into the contractor's boots, getting a sense of what contractors have to deal with during construction. We talked about managing risks and looking at geotechnical uncertainties during the second session. And now we're talking about bridging the gap, or the communication aspect of taking information that we want to do up front. And again, we very commonly are focused on those immediate needs during the design and preliminary investigation. So the focus of these 4 sessions is on the construction side. So when we are doing our investigations, we want to be thinking about constructability and construction. And this session is going to be geared toward the communication side of that. We have one additional session coming up next week, and that's for owners only, and it's going to be a workshop session, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of today. So today's lineup, what you can expect to hear about and discuss during part 2. First, we're going to be talking about a resource, the geoconstructability document that was put together by a Geoconsortium, I think back in 2011. We've talked about it, we've referenced it, but we haven't opened it, and we haven't really got into what that entails. So Jim Morrison is going to lead us off with that and some other thoughts on the geoconstructability aspects. We'll be talking about the communication mechanisms we have from the reporting and geotechnical baseline reports. And then we'll jump into digital transfer of geotechnical data. So the next generation of how we can communicate better in improving our understanding of conditions during construction. And finally, just one mechanism that we have to communicate these conditions is in the digital visualization and integration of that within our, we live in a digital age now. So leveraging that aspect is, I think, where we need to be going if we're going to improve our understanding of conditions and take advantage of that. So that's going to be the itinerary today. Just one disclaimer here. Just recognize that all of these super sessions, we are during the presentations, we may be discussing, and certainly at the end during part 2, we will be getting into a deeper discussions with our panelists, and recognize that all of our points of view are our own. So no one's speaking on behalf of FHWA or our contractors. So just keep that in mind. And all of these sessions are going to be recorded as well. Also, just wanted to point out some resource information. This website here is actually the new A-GaME website. So if you haven't visited that website, please do. There's a lot of resources available there, and some great videos that have been put together. They're very entertaining and very informative. You may have gotten a recent blast for the downhole televiewer, and there's a series of 5 in total for these videos. But check those out, and there's other information resources available there. And if you want to subscribe to and be kept informed of A-GaME activities, you can do that on this website by signing up on the icon that you see down below. So my name is Ben Rivers. I'm with the Federal Highway Administration, and with me moderating this session today is Derek Dozenbrock. In fact, he's going to be leading us in the discussion and kicking us off for that discussion with the presentation. Mary Nodine is also helping us moderate behind the scenes here with GEI Consultants, who has been helping us with the A-GaME promotions under contract. We have several speakers with us today. We have Jim Morrison with STV, Steve Say with Kiewit Construction, Alan Cadden with Snobble, Ken Niss, and John Gill. We're missing John Gill's name there from Keller. They'll be leading us off this morning with presentations in the order that you're seeing, and later on Derek Dozenbrock is going to be kicking us off on the discussion part. And we also have a guest with us, owner representative from Pennsylvania, who will be joining us for the panel discussion. So with that, I am going to introduce Jim, and I'll turn the screen over and let him put his presentation and introduce Jim. Jim Morrison is currently Vice President and Engineering Chief of STV based in Omena, Michigan. Jim has over 40 years experience in heavy civil construction as a geotechnical design engineer, construction company engineering manager, and consultant and advisor on risk mitigation and dispute resolution for a broad range of projects. He has served as president of Deep Foundations Institute and has contributed to several publications, including this reference that he'll be talking about, the ASCE's Geoconstructability, and also a publication on geotechnical baselines for construction, including being he's contributing author for the upcoming 3rd edition for Geotechnical Baselines publication. So with that, Jim, you have the floor, sir.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here to everybody listening. Let me jump to share screen. Apologies, you're seeing all of that, and get to presentation slideshow. All right. You should be seeing my slide. We're going to stop real quick. Okay, you should be seeing the slideshow now. Thank you. So yeah, today's session, it is very interesting, and it really is all about communication. So let's start with a designer, a contractor, and an owner walk into a bar. So, well, I don't really have a joke here, but if I did, it would go something like this. See, the geotech whispers something in the designer's ear. The designer comes out with the right or the specification for gin and the glass and the everything else, and the contractor takes it, mixes it up, and the owner, of course, pays for it all. And they all taste it and goes, well, this isn't quite what I was expecting. So the problem we're dealing with here, switching back to geotechnical side of the world, is that the subsurface information that's developed early in a project's life is often inadequate to address the issues of construction. This is a problem that results in claims and disputes and frustration, and is really what we're trying to get to solve here. So the key question that really addresses this is understanding who we're talking to when we develop a geotechnical report. So there's a lot of different reports and different types and different functions, and the titles of the report need to reflect that. So it's also key to understand, where does the geotechnical engineer fit on this overall team? You know, has he been hired by an owner independently of everybody else to provide data? Is he an arm of the designer, or, you know, just where does he fit, and who is he talking to? So let me just kind of move ahead here. And this goes into the geoconstructability report. As Ben mentioned earlier, this was developed in 2011 with a number of contributing authors. I think Alan, who you'll hear about as well, was also a contributor. And the purpose of this document was to help project this geotechnical information to a level of construction so that it is more useful and solves the problem we talked about. The first thing I want to talk to here is the table that you see on the slide identifies different types of geotechnical reports, whether they're a site assessment, a feasibility. These are in the planning stages. For example, the design memoranda is specifically written during design to address a specific issue. A design summary report is prepared at the end of design to document how the design came together and what was incorporated into that design. And then you get into a constructability memorandum would be something that's written at the time of design to feed into the design process to get people thinking about that and guide the development of construction documents. And then when you get to the level of construction documents, you're dealing with a geotechnical data report or a geotechnical baseline report. So as I was putting this together, I happened to be working on a cost estimate project that came up with this comparison. And if you've been involved in cost estimates, you may know the document, or you may have at least heard of the terminologies that are used here. And just for example, this is the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering, 2005 document. And they talk about whether a construction cost estimate is a class 5 or a class 3 or a class 1 level estimate. And what that means is ultimately that the expected accuracy that you can expect from this level of estimate varies from plus or minus 30% at the conceptual class 5 level to maybe plus or minus 3% by the time you get to a detailed construction estimate. And they give this table in here, which I thought was kind of interesting, which shows the level of project definition on one side and the effort to prepare that level of estimate on the other side. And you can see it's, and this is true. Those that have estimated work, it can be 100 times difference. So when we take that into the geotechnical world, we're looking at reports that come out during a planning phase or a design phase or into construction. And this is made up by me on level of efforts, but I think a lot of people would agree. In a planning phase, when you're doing a feasibility level evaluation, you may have the project defined from 0 to maybe 30%. Now, the geotechnical information at that time is usually done on a grid pattern. So you've got a series of boring points, and plans are developed from there. What we find in most projects, this is the time period when the geotechnical data is gathered. And many times this is the only time geotechnical information is gathered. So once you get into the design phase, the geotechnical engineer will write a memorandum to the designer on a specific issue with advice on how to manage that specific design, the foundation elements, the retaining walls, whatever it happens to be. And at the end of that design, a design summary report is pulled together, which documents the decisions and interpretations used for design. And that's all well and good. And then when the bid documents are pulled together, going into construction, a geotechnical data report, for example, takes all of the factual data and compiles that into one source. And this is used as a contract document attached to the bid documents for the contractor to rely on that factual data in developing his means and methods and developing his cost estimate. One step above that is the geotechnical baseline report, which not only references the factual data, but provides the interpretation of that data for use by a contractor to prepare his bid. So the key to a baseline report is that it's from a project team to a contractor. It's focused on construction issues. So for example, if a design summary report is handed to the contractor, it may or may not be relevant to his construction issues. So this takes it to the next level. Question that arises: how much geotechnical information do I need? And while there are many rules of thumb out there, the answer is enough to address the issue at hand. Now, because of the developing nature of projects, my recommendation when I talk to people is that geotechnical investigations should be phased along with the development of the project, so that the team has the ability to go out and address specific issues at specific times when those questions come up. It's not hard to understand that at that feasibility level stage, when the first geotechs out there collecting data, the level of issues that are going to arise are really not known at that point. It's the plus or minus 30% comparison I was giving. So back to our geoconstructability report, and this is, if with a quick Google search, you'll find that this is free online, which is very good for the industry. But this document attached 10 different appendices for different types of work, and goes through a whole list of issues that are unique to that work and what should be considered when developing a geotechnical report for the purpose of construction. And without going through all of it, I will show an example here for deep foundations. It talks about things like for drilled shafts and for driven piles, the types of information that are critical to accurately estimate those operations. And so this is a good checklist or reference list to get started. And that's the purpose of it. Now there's another reference that's available, and this is the Geotechnical Baseline Reports for Construction document. It's a nice little handbook, first published in '97, updated, the second edition that you see the cover here, called the Gold Book, in 2007. And we are, in fact, have into ASCE for publication the third edition, which will come out hopefully by the end of this year. And if we have our way, it'll be called the Platinum Book. We'll have a platinum bar across the top. But in that document, we also prepared a summary of things to be baselined for things other than tunnels. Now, a little bit of background: that the baseline report concept came out of the tunneling industry. So the document talks about tunnels a lot, but on purpose, we took the word tunneling out of the title, as it's intended to be used for construction in general. And chapter 7 in here focuses on things other than tunnels, like you see on the screen, whether they're driven piles, drilled shafts. you'll see a lot of overlap between this document and the geoconstructability report, but both are good references to use as a checklist as you're developing a geotechnical assessment for the purpose of construction. I'll talk a little bit here about baselines in general. I mean, the purpose of a baseline is first to set a clear and realistic expectation of the ground conditions to be encountered during construction. This is a contractually binding interpretation which keeps all of the different contractors on the same playing field, with the purpose of making the pricing uniform, making the assumptions made very clear so that everybody's on the same sheet of music. And also it assists the contractor in evaluating the requirements he needs for excavation, ground support, those things that a contractor has to design. And it also assists the owner in administering the contract. And if there's a change of conditions from that baseline assumption, the contract change provisions come into play, and this helps the owner administer it without going to court, without fighting through it, is the idea. And it also helps monitor the performance during construction. So that's really the purpose of a baseline report. So key points is the baseline report is the interpretation of geotechnical data, where the data report is the factual presentation of data. Both need to work together, both need to reference each other, but the GBR, the baseline, will take a higher precedence because it is the contractual interpretation. The GBR should be focused on construction issues and not design issues. This is, again, it's a report as a bid document for construction. So those are the issues to be focused on. The sigma, gamma, delta curlicues that you used in design really don't come into play at this level and should be held in another report for other uses. So this report also really, one of the key things here and where things go wrong is when there's a misalignment between what the baseline report says and what the change condition clause says. I've seen several cases that have gone through a very extensive baseline only to turn into the contract general provisions. And it says, basically, there's no right to present a change condition claim. Well, this is a case that ends up in court when you don't have that alignment. Likewise, in the payment provisions, if the baseline is based on one thing and the payment provisions another, then you get into a dispute on what is the baseline and how does this affect my pricing. So common problems that we've seen over the years. Number one is when a design summary report is given a new title pasted on it, call it a baseline, but it's really a design summary report. Doesn't focus on construction, goes through all of the sigma curlicues of design, doesn't matter. They have trouble when they give an inadequate description of conditions to be expected. Like, for example, if the baseline is written as the ground ranges from soft to hard, what does that mean to a contract? It doesn't mean anything. Or they're ambiguous, or they're qualitative. To be as concise and in alignment with the decisions being made for pricing is where this needs to get to. We've seen owners try to play games in putting these together, presenting overly conservative or unrealistic baseline with an attempt to shift risk to the contractor, making him responsible for everything. Sounds good, but many a court case has come out of this scenario. So the lesson learned goes right back to kindergarten: be straight, be fair, be as honest as you can be, and life is better. The fourth most common problems are when there's conflicts really between the baseline and the payment provisions or specifications. If those aren't in alignment, then you're going to have a lot of questions and be shooting from the hip, so to speak, in the field. So in summary, we go back to the geotechnical data. My suggestion in summary here is that data collection geotechnical program be developed to advance along with the development of the project. New questions arise. It allows you to be specific on specific questions as they develop. Second is recognition that contractor issues are different than designer issues. The designer's worried about, will this building sit here for 100 years, and will the differential settlements lead to cracks? The contractor's concerned about, can I get this supportive excavation system in for the next month, and will it stand up? Do I have stand-up time? Do I have water seepage in real time? Not long-term 500-year water levels, but when I'm building this, what can I assume that water level to be during construction? And lastly, that geotechnical reports come in a lot of shapes and sizes, and they should clearly identify the purpose and the intended audience in the title. And that's where, going back to the geoconstructability report, and guidance on what those titles should be very clear. And that will help everybody in communication of issues leading to construction. So that's my summary and presentation, and I will leave you here. Somehow.
You got it. Yeah, I was just pasting the geoconstructability publication, a link to that, just letting people know, check that out. I mean, it really is a great publication with, when you get into the appendices and look specifically at the data or the information that is useful to contractors, it is very enlightening, and using that as a basis and thinking about the A-GaME technologies that we have available and how we can supplement that type of information and sort of above and beyond what we typically have done is great. Thank you very much, Jim. That was a fantastic opener for us in this. And when we get to the discussion and talking about baseline reports, I certainly have jotted down a few things. Our next speaker is Steve Say. Steve is with Kiewit Engineering Group. Steve is a registered professional engineer with over 40 years of experience, spending the last 16 years with Kiewit, primarily working on design, build, and EPC projects in North America. He is the past president of the Nebraska section of ASCE and a life member of ASCE. Steve will be discussing baseline reports a bit more in detail with an example from Hawaii on the rail project there. Steve, you have the floor, sir.
So greeting everyone. So my perspective in the discussion today is from a large company and focusing on design build projects. Let's see if I can get this to advance. So the goal that I would have for this presentation is to get everybody to agree that we all want to build more infrastructure on time at less costs with less risk. And in my experiences, these geotechnical conditions, particularly on the design build projects, can escalate this cost, the schedule, and all those things. And from our experience, we would believe that a geotechnical baseline report can help, particularly on design build projects. Now, some concepts for people that are not necessarily working in the design build world, but it would go to many estimates, is most of the cost and the risk reductions are really related to a contractor, to the tools you're going to bring to the site, the means and methods. How are you going to build something? And many of those decisions, happen, relatively early in the proposal and the bid stage. But if you don't have the right equipment, if you don't have the right stuff, problems are going to happen and costs are going to escalate through there. As we get from the bid stage and we go into, we've won the job and now we've got to go into the final design, that's a pretty concentrated period of activity. And everybody wants to initiate construction quickly through there. And you rarely see design changes occurring in the initial stages, so that the builder is focused on implementing what they've done. So final design is a hard time to be able to significantly change the cost or the schedule. And as I learned very early in my Kiewit career, if the concept's not in the proposal, it's probably not going to be done in the project through there. Some concepts, particularly as things relate to design projects, you want a comprehensive geotechnical investigation pre-bid, and it helps everybody. The design build teams, in many instances, are required to spend significant resources just initially defining the geotechnical issues. Particularly in the case for the job in Hawaii that I'm going to talk about, a geotechnical report can reduce the subsurface risk at bid time by organizing the subsurface data and defining the ground conditions as the basis of bid. And as Jim indicated, it's an opportunity for the owner to lay out the owner's perspective of the ground conditions and align all the contractors so that they're all looking at the same thing. And then with the geotechnical baseline report and this approach, the design build team is then focusing on how to deal with the geotechnical issues, not trying to understand what those issues are. And I believe that's the route to be able to get better projects, lower costs, better schedules. As I said, the wonders, I believe, of a baseline report is you have a single assessment of the subsurface conditions, and I believe that they're best for the owner or the owner's engineer has spent lots of time looking at the project, evaluating the project. They would understand the problems or the issues that we need to do regarding the subsurface conditions. And this provides a method for them to be able to communicate those to the contractor teams and getting the contractor to focus on the things that are important for the project and important for the owner. Now, as we look at the things that the owner has a geotechnical engineer and they're involved in the process, I believe it's extremely important for them to look at what are the 2 or 3 important geotechnical factors that are going to significantly impact the project. It could be a settlement issue, it could be a pile issue, but every project has a couple of things that are really kind of driving the show from the geotechnical part of or perspective there. And then I believe that it is important for that engineering team to simply see that there's enough information provided so that competitive proposals can be developed. And that is not only a discussion regarding what the ground conditions are, but it's also, do you need consolidation tests? Do you have enough information to be able to evaluate the particular mode of settlement that's going on? Did you define the ground conditions of where the piles are going to go? And it's my opinion that the owner's geotechnical engineer needs to focus on site characterization. What are the ground conditions there? Now, things that really aren't very important to the design builder is the owner's foundation or ground improvement design. I mean, we'll have an obligation to go develop ours, and where the owner may have something that they would like to see through there, the design builder is going to have to go do that and do it on their own, and we're probably going to repeat what the owner's done in that particular instance. And as long as we have sufficient information to be able to understand the ground conditions and to be able to characterize the engineering behavior, we're going to be in pretty good shape through there. Now, I'll focus on this many more times, a GBR helps by defining the ground conditions at bid, and it also is very important where the owner can focus the design build teams or the contractors on key issues about those ground conditions. Now, an example we'll have is two projects that Kiewit bid and constructed in Hawaii. The total price was about $800 million. The project is complete. And it was essentially an elevated guideway for much of the project where monoshaft foundations were spaced about at 125-foot intervals for 16 miles. The GBRs were prepared by Parsons Brinkerhoff, now WSP. And you can, if those people that are familiar with Honolulu, this would be a schematic, but we essentially wrapped around Pearl Harbor through there. The thing that was unique regarding this geotechnical baseline report is the picture on the right is a graphical portrayal of the ground conditions along the alignment. You can see that the soil units are pretty easy to visualize there. Selective geotechnical information is provided on the logs. And the important thing is that Parsons Brinkerhoff drew lines between the borings, something that's rarely seen. But we had profiles of the ground conditions developed, not individual boring logs. And this is in the context that because it's a design build job, borings, about 20% of the required borings had been provided at bid time, and the design build team had to do the other 80%, and this provided a mechanism to be able to understand what were the ground conditions at bid time and what were the ground conditions that we encountered in our final investigation, and is there a variation that was important through there. Now, things that were built into the project that I think were particularly important and that we see very rarely is that they prepared geotechnical information to help define the contractual ground rules of the bidding process in regards to allocation and definition of the geotechnical risks. And these baselines were developed to serve as a contractual basis for comparison with the actual conditions encountered during construction. And the contractor may rely on these baselines in preparing his price and proposal. The key components of the baseline reports is there was a description of the geologic setting, a definition of the site and subsurface conditions. There was a discussion about past drilled shaft construction experience, since most of the project was really drilled shafts. We had baselines of the stratigraphy and the ground characterization. There was some discussion regarding the design considerations and a specific section that talked about what Parsons Brinkerhoff and the owner considered to be the key construction conditions there. And in the end, after the $800 million worth of construction, we had no claims regarding the subsurface conditions. The assessments that had been made at pre-bid were generally validated with our final design, and we elected to have no claims associated with the conditions had been described in the baseline report. Now, a little bit of additional things that I would look at to try to repeat is, again, the understanding is this pre-bid geotechnical data is the whole basis of the team's design, schedule, and cost from a geotechnical perspective. And it could be 20 or 30% of the information that's really needed. The owner's geotechnical engineer is going to going to accept or select and assemble the information. And it's my belief that a geotechnical baseline report is a very beneficial way to assemble and present this information for a design build project. An element of just some opinions now regarding some things of making the baseline report and those investigations through there. We need a thorough investigation. And in my opinion is a preference for more routine borings or cone soundings rather than a few borings with sophisticated testing. In my past experiences is if we need the sophisticated testing, we're probably going to include it in our final design. But that's going to be focused on a particular scheme or process through there. So more borings, better definition of the site surface conditions we think is better through there. The other thing that we've seen in a variety of reports, all of this information, particularly on a big design project, is going to go into some kind of a 3D model to define the ground conditions. So we absolutely have to have survey information to give us the XYZ information to be able to make that 3D model be successful. Things that I don't see in many geotechnical investigations, you're in a seismic area and the SPT hammer energies are not presented. Groundwater levels are a chronic problem, I think, at least in my instance, of not having a good definition of the groundwater table or having no information on a log as to what the groundwater level is. As a builder, access and having an understanding of pavement section data is always important, particularly for temporary loads, for running cranes, running things like that. That getting access to be able to have that information at bid time is usually important for us. I think, as Alan is going to describe, particularly for the piezo cone information, getting access to the digital data is particularly important, particularly as we're looking to try to assess ground conditions. Drawing numbers or scanning the little squiggly lines on most of the report formats that we've seen are really not what we need. I mean, we need the electronic files or the spreadsheets, the data. And then certainly if the owner has spent the time to be able to put the boring information into GET, we think that it should be provided at bid time so that it's easy to be able to take that electronic information and included in our pre-bid evaluations. Oftentimes borings to sufficient depth are a problem that we would see that particularly dealing with larger diameter foundations, that we find that borings oftentimes don't go deep enough. So having some understanding or review of whether the borings go deep enough, lab tests on what I would consider to be undisturbed samples, coming from a soft ground background, the quality of the samples, understanding whether the samples are disturbed, is something necessary to be able to get high quality samples or undisturbed is something that needs to be developed early on in the project, and handing us information that's all disturbed is not going to help get a low price. And then we love the geotechnical instruction manuals that the states have through there, and it's just I think important to make sure that subcontractors have actually followed the manual there. Timing of information, particularly on the pre-bid, we've certainly seen projects where information can dribble in at the end. Geotechnical design, particularly on a large project, that design work is essentially complete about halfway through the bid period. There's a bunch of other things that have to happen after that, and data that is received after that time, just probably is as much as confusing as helpful. And it just really doesn't do a lot to impact the design builders' means, methods, and costs. receiving the results of an Osterberg cell test on a drilled shaft 2 days before the bid is due, it's just really hard to get that thoroughly evaluated and incorporated. And in the slides, here's my contact information. Happy to be able to talk to people or communicate by email for these concepts through there. And I hope everybody on the call will come away with the presentation with a better understanding as to how a geotechnical baseline report in that process can help with getting successful projects.
Good deal. Thank you so much, Steve. Great presentation. And we're doing great on time. So we did have a question, actually a couple of questions in here, and so we can look at those. Larry Jones was interested in knowing what the range of possible monoshaft spacing was for the Honolulu project.
So they were generally in the 120 to 130 foot zone. Because of some constructability issues, they generally were at the 125 feet. There were a couple intersections when some things had to be adjusted there because of site features, but generally 125 feet.
And so that was from the get-go, that's what they were looking at.
So that's what the design build team selected.
Gotcha.
The spacing was left to the design build teams, but 125 feet is what we developed.
Gotcha. Very good. And we had another question with pre-bid geotechnical data collection. Who should be paying that? So should that be paid by the owner or prorated in the bid price? So the question was, the pre-bid geotechnical data collection should be paid by whom? Owner?
So I think all of the information that's collected prior to bidding should be paid by the owner. And then the information, any information that's required after bidding should be folded into the design build contractor's price.
Okay.
And certainly, as Jim had highlighted, we certainly have seen design build proposals or pursuits where the design builders were given the opportunity to request the owner to do a limited number of investigations during the bid process at specific locations through there, and to be able to provide input for the way that they were made. Particularly on the larger projects, there's always things that you can see where a design builder would say, boy, I'd really like to have information here. And that phased process is an opportunity to be able to get that information and get it incorporated in the bid.
Excellent. So I had a question for you, and actually I was thinking about it. So Jim, pipe up if you have some thoughts on this. But so the during the last session, WashDOT was with us, and we were talking. The conversation went into reporting, and they have a document called a summary of geotechnical conditions, which is it is a contract document. But the way they do baselines is very specific from what I understand. So they're looking at, as an example that he gave, you will, during the construction of this drilled shaft, you will encounter 4 boulders type specificity. So what level of, I know Jim mentioned that you need to align the pay items with the specifications and the ground conditions, but what level of specificity do we need for these geotechnical baseline reports, and what would sort of distinguish that from what, if you're familiar with what WashDOT does with this summary of geotechnical conditions, what's sort of the distinction there? Oh, you're on mute, Jim.
Yes.
Sorry about that. So, yeah, I mean, interesting point, and it's come up before. Now, the answer is you need enough specificity.
That's a hard one for me.
To where the dollars matter. I mean, boulders are an example, and actually, if you can, boulders are one of those things that if you're in a till, you have it. Your borings probably didn't hit it, but it's there. So specifying, for example, contractors should expect to encounter 4 boulders is a very good way of leveling the playing field. A, it acknowledges that they happen. B, it sets a limit in what the contractor can expect. Tying back to the change condition clause, if he hits 6 or 10 boulders, you've got a vehicle then to pay for it.
Yep. Gotcha.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, but I think everybody would recognize that if we were dealing with that in Hawaii, boulders were certainly an issue in a selected section of the alignment through there. But the things that are important will vary from geologic region from 1 to 2 through there. Certainly in Washington State, you would expect that boulders would be a big issue through there. But again, there will be a handful of critical factors that will be important to the project. And the geotechnical engineer needs to go in through there and list them and say, now, have we gotten enough characterization to be able to address that? Is there enough information so that we've characterized the ground conditions through there? And then do the baseline reports marry up with what we think these 2 or 3 critical conditions are?
Gotcha. So in that process, I mean, you're looking at doing a risk assessment of some sort during, or is for distinguishing those types of big issues that you're anticipating. You're specifically looking at the risks, the project risks, and putting those and strategically hitting those.
Well, and I think that in many of these projects, a communication between, particularly on a geotechnical area, every contractor, or at least, we would be, pretty open, want to be open with the owner of saying, here are the things that we think are real risks through there. And having that open, and the answer is, or the approach is, how do you get the right answer? I mean, we're really striving to go into this process to be able to characterize the ground conditions so that we've done a good job and nobody's surprised.
Right.
And seeking input at the beginning or even before the project begins of, what's important or what's going to drive the costs, gotcha. I think is just good practice through there.
Yep, absolutely.
And that's actually a very good point, because the next question that comes up is, well, gee, I got to dig up the whole alignment so I can accurately count something. And that's really where the baseline report is going to say, okay, we don't know how many there are, but this is what you're going to assume. This is where the payment provisions come in, and an alignment there. And one of the better ways to handle that is when we know we've got a known unknown, is you set up a provisional sum or a contingency fee in your budget to accommodate that, so that the costs of that are captured in the project's budget, so nobody gets surprised.
Gotcha. It's anticipated. It's not a known quantity necessarily, but you've got a contingency.
Another example would be, we've all seen sections of alignment where there is a right-of-way problem or there's an environmental problem, and you don't have any information. And one approach is essentially to tell the contractors to go guess, and we don't agree with that.
Right.
The other approach of a baseline report is for the condition of bid, the owner can go in and say, we want you to assume this. The glacial till is at a depth of 50 feet. You're going to have to go in and do additional borings when we get the right of way. And here's a contractual basis as to where you can get paid. Everybody pays fairly after the information is obtained. And to me, the baseline reports are particularly valuable where the information is just lacking.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you both very much. There was one other question for you, Steve, specifically here on the 3D tomography investigation cost, or were the 3D tomography investigation costs covered by Kiewit?
So the point that I was making, we didn't do tomography. I mean, what we would do is we'll take the geotechnical information and to put it into a 3D CAD program. So this is an element of just summarizing the geotechnical information for our design work.
Gotcha.
So it's just reflecting of the information going into a CAD program and defining that. The other projects have not had, while we could input seismic information and things like this, it's just recognizing that the information will go into some kind of a 3D program.
Gotcha. Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. There were a couple other questions there, but we'll get to those a little bit later. We are right on time here. So as I introduce our next speaker, Alan Cadden, Alan, you can start loading up here. Alan is a principal with Snobble Engineering and is located out of Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, where he provides senior leadership with the company's geostructural and infrastructure monitoring services. Mr. Cadden is a licensed engineer in 10 states. He is an active member in several ASCE, ADSC, and DFI technical committees. He's the past president of the Geo Institute of ASCE and the International Society of Micropiles, and is currently a trustee for the Deep Foundations Institute. Alan, welcome. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. Should see the screen now, hopefully.
Not yet.
Try it again. Share, there we go. Forgot to click that last share button.
You got it.
Okay, so we're going to talk, coincidentally, and I guess intentionally, this conversation really complements what Steve just touched on in the baseline geotechnical report and the need for providing data to the contractors. Because the data really does serve a purpose throughout the entire life of a project. Jim talked about the first half of the project, but it really does play a part throughout construction and even into the long-term asset management, as we'll talk about here a little bit. So if you're as old as I am, you might recognize many of these formats and most likely spent much of your career rummaging through drawers, looking for the right disk or thumb drive, or converting it or converting it in and out of Excel, Lotus 123, or whatever other tools of the day you might have had to get the data into some format that you could use. The beauty of computers, though, throughout our careers, is that projects are getting larger and we're able to create more and more data. We're generating massive amounts of information to provide to the contractors. And that information should be able to be used during construction and to develop the bids. The key thing is, though, we dump all this massive amounts of data on you or information on you and ask how soon can you give me the price. And as Steve indicating, getting data 2 days before the bids due doesn't do anybody any good because we just can't assimilate it into the process. So let's cut to the chase. What if we did something totally different? DIGS is a standard that we've been working on for about 15 years. And the goal is to be able to exchange data in a common structure that software can understand and use. We don't want to continue to manipulate spreadsheets, columns, and try to figure out what units they're in to make sense of it. This is not a proprietary system. It's open source, and everyone is welcome to contribute to its development and the refinement of the schema itself so that we can keep it growing. It's an XML schema, so it's just like a web page. If you've ever accidentally right-clicked on a web page and picked source, you see something that looks like this. Every web browser out there knows how to read those XML files and turn those into web pages. All DIGS does is provide the definition and the structure for how to describe the actual geotechnical data elements and the metadata about that data point. So how was it collected? What test was used? What, I was going to say time of day, but where it was in the sample, where it was in your boring profile, all the pertinent data to help you understand what that piece of data really means. So it's a common format that we can all understand, or at least that we can program our software to understand and file this data quickly for us. The other beauty of it, as Steve indicated, is it's tied to geographic markup language, so GML. GML is what's used by every geographic information system out there. It has that X, Y, Z coordinate system tied to every piece of data in DIGS. So we know where it is, and we know where that is in the space to be able to create those 3D models. DIGS is also extensible. So although it was created originally for geotechnical exploration, typical borings, lab testing, a little bit of geoenvironmental information, we are already expanding it and have capability to document a lot of grouting information, measurement while drilling, instrumentation, and geophysics. So the opportunities to continue to collect and compile and transmit more geotechnical data continues to grow. So in a nutshell, if you could record it on a form in the past, we've developed rules for how to write all of that data into a computer format. So take any piece of data on this sheet, and we have a place to put it in the DIGS schema to be able to transmit it to anybody out there to use later. So now let's think a bit about who and how they would want to use this data. In a life cycle of a project, there are many stakeholders that you can see here, and all of them have a need for this data in one form or another. Starting with consultants, it's my world. The concept that data can be collected in the field with whatever digital manner you would like, and then we never touch it again, was really intoxicating to me. Just as I mentioned, the swapping in and out of Excel and all kinds of other programs just doesn't make sense anymore. But you start thinking about that workflow and the process improvements that you can make if you're not spending all your time manipulating and retyping and rechecking data sets. It's a huge opportunity for us. So there's real time and cost savings sending data to and from consultants. That's a real labor saving step there. We are eliminating wasted time of data entry and reentry. The QA/QC processes are done once, really at the point of data entry. And then we're also seeing the benefit of reduced risk. So now, instead of potentially fat finger typing data into another spreadsheet, we know the data is being transmitted directly as it was intended from the beginning. So the goal of that is to really leave us with more time to do the fun analysis, hopefully providing better solutions and better construction documents. So we think about the owner side of the table here. Really, many of those benefits I just spoke about for the consultants apply to owners as well. How many times have we heard about somebody saying that one department of an owner's organization doesn't know what the other one's talking about, or they collected the data and we didn't know they had it already. It's really a matter of being able to easily transmit this data know what's there, store it in a common way so we can get to it easily. Now, instead of spending time collecting and recollecting data and looking through old dusty files in the warehouse, we're talking more about how we optimally use that data. Can we start assessing where our real vulnerabilities are across the site, whether it's landslide, slope stability issues, maybe it's seismic liquefaction issues. We're aggregating data over more than just the one site that we're focused on, but we can aggregate it across a large region or a state or the nation and start making sense out of it and protecting ourselves or managing our assets a little better. So for the contractors, I think you heard a couple benefits from Steve and Jim. Really, we want to get away from the idea of junior engineers and estimators spending days and weeks poring over paper reports and recreating profiles and tables to be able to understand the geotechnical issues on a site. If they had immediate access to the data as well and can process that data in their own way to answer key questions, they're going to be a step ahead on trying to move forward with developing good construction procedures, bids for your projects, and understand the process better. I think they're also going to be able to start seeing the benefit of aggregating that data, both from the geotechnical exploration side, but also from their past construction history, and starting to learn how to do their jobs better and what's conditions to watch out for as they're planning for new projects. So we think about the life cycle and how we shuffle data around a project. The first design stages, you can see we're moving data all over the place in proprietary formats, PDF formats, converting stuff in spreadsheets. We're doing all kinds of stuff. And the goal, I think there was a question from Melissa Bates, is how do we exchange CPT data in a common format that doesn't require specialty software? Well, here it is right here. That's the DIGS method. It can transmit that CPD data, just like any other data, to a contractor in a way that they can use it in their own software tools, whatever they may be, to improve their process. But let's think about it if we go a little beyond the design stage and we now have the data in a shareable format and geographically located in some sort of a map system. Now we're able to look at that data and share it for bidding purposes. We can transmit that data directly into the field for layout of the foundation elements, and so that the operators of the rigs can understand what the installation parameters need to be, depth, size, what kind of resistance they're looking for the foundation capacity or the bearing materials. And then they can also take that data and transmit it back to the office and back to the owner as in the form of their as-built reports and become part of the actual BIM model for the project for the long-term management of that asset. So we're now in a digital world. We're talking about big data. It's about time to stop maintaining manual spreadsheets, and we want to be able to mine that data for real-time reports, whether that's during design, construction, or that long-term management. Obviously, one of the first ways we want to use that data is to be able to see it geographically. Where is it located on our site? But how about if we could start grabbing portions of that data and quickly seeing what that batch of data means? Jim Peng with Artemin, when he was with Artemin, developed some pretty cool tools with Louisiana DOT that would allow you to grab any set of data on a project and start seeing kind of an automatic generated soil profile, and dig a little deeper and you can see what the moisture content variation is across that site, or shear strength, or SPT value. How do I start understanding the data, not just in the report format that was provided to you, but digging down a little deeper so that you can make sense out of it as you start thinking about how you're going to build that project and move through the site. Could also be a site where there are 300 CPTs, and we need to quickly look at those and understand across the site, where are the sand layers, where are they thicker, where are the organic materials, how might that impact my construction scheduling or process as I move through the site. Or maybe I want to look at the geophysics and see how they correlate with the borings. And are there any surprises between borings that I should potentially watch out for, or maybe go get a little more data to help fill in that gap? Or as Steve said, let's start putting in three-dimensional images and start understanding what's going to happen on our site. And I can peel back that surface layer and see where all the geophysics and all the borings were done on the site, so I can start understanding how things are laid out instead of just taping printouts from a report together and hanging them on the wall. I can zoom in and see some more detail and focus on those borings and geophysics that are of interest in a certain area, and then add my retaining wall to it and see how that overlaps, and maybe even how those anchors are going to interact with the anticipated ground conditions. Again, if you want to think about a dam site, we've got borings on a dam. It's easy to see that in 2 dimensions, but these are all oriented in different directions. So how do I understand how the orientations look below ground and what they're penetrating, what materials they might be penetrating? How that might interact with the core trench that's going to have to be excavated for construction of that dam, or potentially impact the grout curtain that we have to drill and install for the project. Here's a kind of an interesting example of bridge abutment sitting on the top of a rock knob. As you can see, there's some bedding planes in that rock formation that are kind of not really conducive to holding up that rock block forever. So we have to anchor that block together. And to do that, you're drilling through the bridge deck and hanging under the bridge deck in really limited access conditions. So how can you adapt to the very irregular site conditions and access restrictions you have out there? Well, that data is provided to you digitally. You can now look at that in 3D, understand where those anchors are going to be located. And if we start tying that to the design analysis itself, we can feed the data back and forth. And as you realize you can't get to that one spot for an anchor, you need to move it over a couple feet. You can update the analysis and make sure you're getting the strength requirements that you need. But more importantly for the contractor, you can also understand conflict issues with, if I move that anchor and I have to put it in a different orientation, is there a potential for me to intersect one of the other anchors that were already drilled? So understanding that on the fly and in real time in 3 dimensions, so you can actually visualize what's going on, can be a great asset for your project. A little more traditional vertical elements, how do these elements interact with the local geology? Questions about, as I'm doing this installation, are these elements reaching the bearing stratum that were intended? Do we wait until a stack of PDF reports are delivered at the end of the project and the engineer has to, retype these into a spreadsheet and reassess their quality control at the end of the job? Or do we actually feed this data in real time back to the engineers and back to the office so the people can be summarizing that and making sure the project's going as anticipated? Some of you might have seen this already, but on a screen, all this data, even these 3-dimensional models that I just showed you, that can be spun around and seem pretty cool and everything, really are still just 2-dimensional representations on a screen. However, we're now in a world where these VR headsets are readily available pretty cheap, and we're able to start viewing this data in real 3 dimensions. We can walk around and walk through and under a project and start to really understand what's happening in the subsurface conditions and how our construction processes might impact those conditions or how they might impact the construction. Just a final word, there's a new kind of not-for-profit group that's aggregating data from across the country into a portal that will allow you to compare your data with other nearby conditions. The GeoSet is pulling in right now a lot of publicly available data, and they're going to continue to expand this. But start thinking about how we can use this to understand not just the site we're on, but maybe some of the other regional conditions around it and anticipate problems that might come up. Or maybe we want to compare the geologic conditions here with a similar geologic conditions in another area that we've worked with in the past. Having this larger amount of data is going to start making us smarter about what we do. So we're all collecting a ton of data these days. Unfortunately, the promise of paperless offices has yet to become a reality, and we still transmit flat information sheets. The A-GaME tools are all digital, from the televiewer and the geophysics to CPT and MWD. It's really time that we begin to fully utilize that digital data to become more efficient and effective in our work. And that's all for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alan. Great overview of where we need to go from the digital side of things, and thanks for answering that question from Melissa. If people, I don't know if they had were seeing the question, but Melissa's question centered around the fact that in her agency, CPT data didn't make it through a certain process to actually put into plans because not everybody had that data available, and what DIGS makes capable is the fact that this is non-proprietary data data in a form that's non-proprietary, and everybody can make their own use of that data, and which is a great level playing field these days. There was one other question that came in, and and John Michael Ryan, if you I'm going to ask a little clarification here. Your question was, can you see interpretive bedrock depths around the United States? And that interpretive is, so what Alan just showed in the GeoCeta arrangement is data, and there are, from my understanding, the ability using AI to come up to some realistic presentation of that. But the from a contracting side, obviously we don't usually specify, or just from the liability side, interpreted data without, it's usually factual type data. But Alan, I don't know if you wanted to share how, the fact that we have this, a lot of data can allow us to do a lot more things.
I think your point about GeoCeta, they started with Maryland DOT developing this tool internally, but it really was, by using machine learning and all this masses of data that DOT had, they were able to do some predictions of rock depth, or even what the boring conditions might be like, how much, you're going to encounter sand materials or clay materials, and, approximately what the ground conditions could be like. And I think as more data becomes available, those kind of machine learning tools will be more robust. They're never going to replace site-specific data, but they are, as Jim was pointing out early on, conceptual design tools. They're there and they're available to help us be a little smarter early in the project, and understand the potential risks that are in the region.
Very good. Thank you very much, Alan. Great presentation.
My pleasure. Thanks.
So our next presenter, we actually have two presenters, and Ken and John, you can cue up your presentation as I introduce you. Ken Niss and John Gill are both from Keller. Ken is a senior engineer with Keller North America and chairman of Keller's rigid inclusion product team, where he focuses on improving Keller's ability and capacity to perform rigid inclusion projects across North America. Ken has 15 years experience working with Haywood Baker and Keller. He holds a bachelor's in civil engineering from Bucknell University and a master's of science in geotechnical engineering from the University of Texas, Austin. John Gill is a project manager with Keller North America, where he focuses on ground improvement, excavation support, and deep foundation projects across the Midwest. He holds a bachelor's of science in civil engineering from Tufts University and a master's of science in project management from Northwestern University. John And Ken, welcome. You have the floor.
Thanks so much, Ben. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Perfect.
And I'm seeing your screen.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're talking today about data acquisition. And data acquisition is something that I think we're all familiar with in some way, shape, or form. We're going to be talking about it within the context of rigid inclusions today, which is a ground improvement technology, and how it's being applied on a job for the Minnesota DOT. I'll talk a little bit about just what is a data acquisition system and how it can be used to explore a site. And then John is going to wrap up with a quick case history of how we're using this technology and this approach on an existing project. The data acquisition system is essentially taking information from the field. What you're seeing here at the upper right-hand corner is a snapshot of a screen that the operator might see inside the drill rig. That information being uploaded to a cloud and making its way to a computer in your office. That's kind of the current capabilities, right? But we've done a lot of data acquisition in the past, especially with DOT work. If you just think about pile driving, right? At the time, pile driving, or still is, you looking for blows per foot, right? So you're getting feedback from the installation that's helping you understand, am I achieving the goals of the design for that element? We're doing the same thing with rigid inclusions, but that's not the only type of technology that we do it with. Here's an example of some soil nail walls, both temporary and permanent. These are all some Keller projects, right? Just getting people in the idea of like how different data acquisition is working for different projects. We may not be uploading real-time data for this kind of thing, but we're getting things like depth and grout quantities and shot creep volumes. All that feedback is data acquisition. Same thing for a slope repair, right? The depth that we're treating, making sure we're getting beyond the failure plane. Here's a picture of a micropile installation. Deep foundation often done for bridges or abutments. You're getting drill logs, right? The driller is keeping the depth that reinforcement is set, trying to confirm that against how deep the drill log says that it went. Also looking at grout volumes. Drilled shafts, kind of similar in that way. There are some initiatives towards measure while drilling, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in context with rigid inclusions for evaluating soil properties or soil conditions as we go. But drill shafts are also an example of something where we're getting data as we're doing the installation. Moving on to ground improvement, here's some equipment that might be used to install a stone column or aggregate pier. On the right side is a pre-drill rig. You may not be getting a lot of data from that other than depth, but on the left-hand side is a vibrofloat, right? So we're getting information like stone volumes and the amount of energy that's going into compacting the stone, right? Telling us something about the density in the soils around it. So all these indicators that we can capture during the installation. And the topic of today is a rigid inclusion. We're using typically the kind of large European style drill rigs. What you're seeing on the left-hand side here is what's called a Bauer BG36. And we're going to talk about some of the components of that and what are the things that we can measure, the data that we can acquire during the installation. One other thing to point out here is part of the process is pumping grout or concrete, and so there's a concrete pump used for that. That's also something that you can acquire data from during the installation to monitor quality control. Just before we jump into the rigid inclusion, kind of clarify what that is a little bit. It's usually a grout or concrete column and typically unreinforced. Definitely used for a lot of building supports, but also within the framework of DOT work for column supported embankments. So those elements are installed, underneath the slope and underneath the roadway, usually in combination with a load transfer platform, which is something that is helping to spread the load out, transfer it to the rigid inclusion. That load transfer platform may also be used to reduce lateral deformations, especially for like an MSE wall, and reduce the amount of reinforcement that's needed inside the rigid inclusion. So let's talk about kind of the anatomy of that data acquisition system. What is it that we're actually measuring? On the left-hand side here is a large drill rig. Up at the top is the rotary head. And so it's turning to advance the tool. We can measure the rotation speed, how fast it's turning, as well as the torque, or how much effort is being applied to the tool to turn it. Right, we typically think of torque in terms of like foot-pounds or kilonewton meters, but sometimes we have to get that information as far as acquiring the data from hydraulic pumps that are operating that head housed here within the body of the rig. Another thing that we're going to look at that we have the ability to capture is information from the crowd winch, right? So this is getting to crowd force or crowd pressure. Depending on the software and the hardware that's available for your project, you might be able to get the actual crowd force. In other cases, you may also be getting a hydraulic pressure, again, kind of indicating how hard the rig is working to push the tool into the ground. In addition to those kind of energy parameters, we can also look at the depth, right? We're going to compare that to the borings, as we'll see later, but also the penetration rate. Right? Ideally, right, the faster it goes in the ground, the softer the soil is. So those are other things that we can record and use as context for evaluating this information. Getting on the second half of the installation, right, you've gotten to the bottom. Now there's some things that are important for quality control that I want to point out, because we can capture that information and it is useful, even though that's not really going to be the majority of the discussion today. This grout pressure sensor, it's usually located near the top of the drill string, and that gives us the ability to monitor the grout pressure, making sure that we have sufficient head and can build the right geometry of the column that we want. And there's also the grout or concrete pump that I mentioned previously. There's typically two ways that you can count the strokes from that pump, which give you an indication of the volume that's going into the element. Sometimes we'll have that stroke counter located directly on the pump. Other times it can be in line here and attached to the rig. So it's counting kind of a pressure spike in the grout as it passes through. What I'm showing now is the output, right? We've collected all the data on the rig as I showed at all those different locations. And now here it is, it's made it to your computer in a way that you can look at it and evaluate it. So a couple of things here. Working left to right, we have crowd speed and crowd pull. This is push and pull. So a little bit tricky here. I got a dashed line here, which is the 0 line. So the drilling rate, is kind of on the way down, and the withdrawal rate is on the way up. Kind of looking at positive on the right and negative on the left. Same thing for the crowd force here. So the blue or on the left side is the force going down, and on the right side is the withdrawal of the element. A couple of things here to indicate how hard the rig is working. In addition to that crowd force, this is now the rotary pressure. So that's how hard that drill head is working. Another interesting thing is the penetration resistance, and I'll explain that just a little bit more in a second. But this is a specific parameter to this particular system, and we use this quite a bit at the Minnesota DOT project. Then collecting that grouting information, looking at the max and min grout pressures as we're extracting the tool. And then all the way on the right-hand side here, you're getting an idea of how much volume is put in kind of per stage. The program defines the stage as 1.64 feet, which is about half a meter. taking a little closer look at that penetration resistance or alpha value. So the manufacturer of this software and this hardware defines it as a torque versus penetration rate, essentially. And penetration is defined as the distance that the tool travels for one rotation of the tool. And then looking at how much effort goes into that, the torque, and normalizes that into one value that is kind of giving you an idea of the effort required to advance the tool. The manufacturer, right, defines this as the index for penetration resistance, and it shows the bearing capacity of the soil. I think we have to be a little bit careful using that, right? There's a little bit of promotional language probably, or maybe overpromising that's going into this by the manufacturer. But we definitely think that it's a valuable tool and one that we've used, and we'll show you an example of that here in a bit. Just wanted to point out, while we're looking at this, some big changes that I think are useful, right? If you look at this red kind of squiggly line here for the penetration resistance, that value gets really low from about 20 to 50 feet. And we know from comparing that to borings that this is a softer soil layer. And then, where we anticipated the bearing layer here around 51, 52 feet, that penetration resistance goes way, way up. And that's consistent with, right, a very dense sand that we knew we were towing into. So this is kind of telling us that we can get information from the installation that correlates in some ways to what's happening within the soil profile. And that's our first conclusion, right? We can use this recorded data, and especially where there's large differences, loose or soft soils, hard or dense soils, that we can tell the differences between those during the installation process. And this is information that the driller can see as he's sitting in the seat, right? So this is really valuable for the driller to be able to look for those target depths. I do want to just take a step back and qualify, right, that this data is not universal and cannot be applied everywhere, right? What we found is that it can vary on the drill rig based on the way that the tool is designed, right? That can be the location of the cutting teeth, the angle of the teeth, the flight, the pitch of the augers, the tooling diameter. And also it can vary based on the operator. Not all operators and not all drill rigs are created equal. And so that needs to be taken into account when we're trying to interpret this data. But we do think that for a single site, where you have a lot of uniformity within these variables, that it can be a useful tool. So how can we use this to explore a site? We've got a couple of pictures here. Here's one of Keller's drill rigs, and then a boring rig in the background. Here's a CPT rig. Right, different levels of sophistication, I think, on some level with these. And right, when you're doing a boring, when you're doing the CPT, the goal is to get information, to record it and log it as accurately as possible. The driller's job, on the other hand, is to put the element in the ground as fast as possible with the best quality possible. So we have to, I think, account for some of those differences in intent when interpreting the information as well. Just knowing that we're going to see more resolution out of borings and CPTs than we will out of a log that's created from a drill rig. I thought it'd be useful to just go through, one quick comparison. On the left side here is the CPT rate plot, and then the corresponding installation log that was installed immediately adjacent. A couple of things to point out, right? We talked about those big differences in the soil types. So here at 20-ish feet, we have a pretty dense soil layer. There's another one here in the 70 to 75 range, and then kind of a bearing layer down here below 85 feet. And when we look at the layer at 20 and at 80 some feet, we see a couple important things. Here's the penetration rate in the red, right? It gets closer to that black line, so it's decreasing as the soils get more dense, and then increases where we have this loose silt. Down here at the bottom, where we get back into that dense layer, that penetration rate is decreasing again. The other things we can look for is the crowd force, right? How hard is it pushing? That value has increased here in that dense sand. Again, here at the bottom, it's lower down in the middle through the soft silt or loose silt. And then that penetration resistance or alpha value. We also see some spikes here through this dense sand, dropping down to a very low value, and then increasing back up again below 83, 84 feet. So right, we can see these trends and use that as something that will help us to understand the installation relative to the geotechnical investigation that was done prior to arriving on site. One thing I did want to point out, right, with this, what appears to be a very dense sand layer, but also relatively thin, is that those layers can be hard to pick up and really understand well from the installation log. And that kind of goes back to what is the intent of the CPT versus what is the intent of the installation log and the person that's executing that. Here at 70 feet, there's a slight drop in the penetration rate, but not much. That might be hard to pick up if you weren't really looking for it. Same thing here with the crowd force. It jumped up just a little bit, but it's a relatively small blip. And then the penetration resistance, which we've been tracking as well as we've gone through the presentation here, that also had a small increase, but really not much different than what we had in what would be probably, considered a stiff clay or maybe loose to medium silt here right below that. So we have to be careful when interpreting these laws with respect to thin layers. When we get to a job site, we want to explore, similar to what was done during the geotechnical investigation. I'm showing an example here of a parking garage layout, and there's borings all across the site. See 1 through 4 up top, 5 to 7 in the middle, and 8, 9, and 10 to 11 at the bottom. And we placed, what we call indicators. Here's these green dots here as locations adjacent to those borings as a way for us to calibrate the installation to those borings. So basically the same process we just went through on the previous slide, doing that at multiple locations across the site and understanding the variability and how the driller and the engineer can understand each other and interpret the data in a way that's effective for the design intent. So conclusion number 2 is we can compare these indicator elements to the previous geotechnical explorations. This is a way to calibrate our interpretation of the installation data. As we talked about, thin layers can be difficult to identify, and we didn't really touch on this a lot, but intermediate soil conditions, especially transitions, from loose to medium dense sand or from soft to stiff clay, those can be hard to identify the same way that they'd be able to identify through an SPT boring or a CPT sounding. And with that, I will hand it over to John Gill to finish up.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken. Next slide, please. So the project that we just wanted to speak briefly of is a project, active project. It was started, early design phase work, started around 2018, and it is expected to finish up in the fall of 2023. So it's in northern Minnesota on the shores of Lake Superior. It's a massive infrastructure kind of rehabilitation and reconfiguration. Locally, it's known as the Can of Worms interchange. And it's, current in its original form, it was 33 bridges, many of which, this is 1960s, 70s infrastructure. Many at this point have weight restrictions. And the design intent is to take all of these elevated overpasses and bridges and move a lot of the traffic onto embankments placed on the existing kind of ground surface you see in the foreground here. You can kind of get the sense we're right on, Lake Superior, so deep lacustrine lake fills, naturally deposited organics, highly compressible organics. So as we place new fill, tendency for that to consolidate. Next slide, please. So the team, so Minnesota DOT is the owner, and many thanks to them for allowing Keller to share a little, very small piece of this project. The project delivery method is a CMGC and is a partnership between Minnesota DOT and Ames Kramer joint venture, who's been involved as the CM since the nascent stages of the project. Minnesota DOT also hired Barr, who is involved in really the entirety of the geotechnical design, working closely with MnDOT. So there were over 500 borings completed across the site, about 250 or so along the alignment of the ground improvement, rigid inclusion locations, and everything else was for associated structures and kind of shallow borings. The Itasca Group is a subcontractor of Barr's, and they're responsible for all numerical modeling. So Barr put together, Barr and MnDOT put together a really comprehensive 3D soil, geotechnical model, which we've all been discussing this morning. And then Itasca really was responsible for working with Barr to come up with ultimately the full, rigid inclusion design. So in this case, Keller is really just rigid inclusion installer. But I think this speaks, and hopefully the rest of the presentation speaks well to kind of the required partnership between all the teams to utilize the power of comprehensive investigations, which we've been talking about, coupled with data acquisition. Next slide, please. So super cartoonish concept sketch. Again, variable urban fills. You see thicknesses vary, 5 to 30 feet. Thick silt lake deposits existing, and this is really what the rigid inclusions are looking to help transmit the load through into a till, stiff clay, variable deposits, at depth. And so those kind of new embankment heights range anywhere really from 4 to about 20 feet. So pretty significant amount of load. Structures, all the bridge overpasses and the highly loaded walls are all founded on driven piles by the joint venture team. And Keller is really just responsible for executing the installation of the rigid inclusions. Next slide, please. So just specifically kind of our scope of work, there's a grand total of just under 7,000 rigid inclusions, totaling over 300,000 linear feet. Again, super variable site. You can see the hillside off to the left-hand side of the screen, and you can kind of imagine the lake to the right. So, highly variable. Lengths between 30 and 104 feet is thus far the deepest rigid inclusion. Over the course of the project, Keller is also installing 9 full-scale compression load tests, tested to ultimate capacities of 137 to 550 kips. And these are on 16-inch rigid inclusions. And so at this point in the project, Keller is complete with about 70% of that scope of work. And the overpass you see on the left-hand side is currently in use, while the right-hand side is being paved really as I speak. And then that traffic will be flipped and replaced next year. Next slide, please. So I spoke to the really comprehensive modeling efforts. This is just a very small snapshot of one section of the project. You see a lot of colored dots on the screen. So each one of those dots is a rigid inclusion. And you can imagine those are basically at variable spacing between 8 and 10 feet. You will also see a number of gray classic boring marks in the background. Again, speaking to the really dense nature of all of the borings. And so each one of those rigid inclusions I've just kind of shown, this is one of the more variable areas of the site, and each of the colors correspond to a difference between the plan length and actual length of rigid inclusions as they've been installed. So based on the modeling efforts that were performed, Barr and Itasca came up with estimated plan lengths of every rigid inclusion. So at this point, we're about 70% complete, as I mentioned, and total aggregated kind of difference is about 3% difference between plan and actual. So, really, very accurate modeling as a whole. But you see in some areas, like this area, we have, quite a bit of variation where closer to those borings, as anticipated, we have really good resolution of the data, right? And great ideas of, kind of where those rigid inclusions may found at, kind of the midpoints as we interpolate between the borings. In some cases, we get areas of, differences up to about 20 feet. And in a couple other locations, much more than that. And so this really, again, speaks to, if you kind of think of each rigid inclusion, if you have appropriate amounts of data acquisition, you can kind of think of each one as its own CPT installed real time as we go. So if we just look at one specific, next slide, please. So like here's one rigid inclusion in particular, which had a plan length of about 37 feet. So as that driller drills down at 37 feet, he's not picking up that alpha resistance that Ken mentioned, and advances up to, about 56, 58 feet. So that difference is, around 18 feet. And really, without having that data acquisition, it would really just be based on driller feel. And so this is kind of the power of that, and then having, a record of each one of those quote unquote CPTs. Next slide, please. And so this just really kind of brings us to our final conclusion, which is, with the appropriate, like I said, with the appropriate amounts of data acquisition, we can really interpolate between explorations, to determine appropriate installation depths or parameters, whatever that may be. And similar kind of back to what Ken was saying, obviously some caveats on that, just based on actual conditions, but with some consistency across the same site regarding drill tooling and kind of drill rig operators, that sort of thing. It's a really powerful tool, both in terms of, again, interpolating and extrapolating from, where borings could or could not be performed. Again, really just speaks to the need for, partnerships between contractors and design teams, which this has been a real success. So, with that, I will turn it back over to Ben.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, John, very much. Great presentation. And really speaks to the fact that we do live in this digital world. And, I'm curious to know your thoughts. The fact that now we have the ability to provide CPT data beforehand to inform you of those types of conditions, and you have the ability to collect data real time during your processes that provide feedback to those types of conditions. How do you see, obviously, very similar to measurement while drilling, the tooling, the drilling system is going to play a part, the wear on the bit, all of those types of things have to be considered in the measurement that you're getting. But understanding the fact that you have data that you get, beforehand, and now you have data that you can provide back. How do you see the value there, in both, making your estimates and also being able to provide some criteria for acceptance or, to the owner, using this type of communication of real data?
Yeah, it's hugely valuable. It's the trick that I always find is kind of what you're doing with that data and how realistic it is to store and use in the future. But when the data can be provided both from design teams in raw format, which we've kind of been talking about today, from CPTs, and where that raw format can be analyzed by design companies like Keller or Itasca Barr, in these these examples. That is, kind of the step one. And then step two is on site. How do we iterate and be smart about, what we're installing? I mean, even in the short term, the last 10 years that I've been working, Keller has gone from, call it 30 feet to, let's call, 30 feet as a first guess and then iterate as we go.
Very cool.
Based on instrumentation. So it takes a long time. And what you do with that data is
very cool. Very cool. Thank you very much. And talking about MWD, I saw so many similarities with the data that you were providing there. Have you, knowing that there is, these interrelationships between drilling systems, have you all looked at some of these compound parameters that are similar to for MWD, where you're looking at drilling energy, specific energy, to sort of normalize those differences? Have you seen any value in that?
Yeah, so really the presentation that Ken and I just gave was specific to a particular technique,
right?
And specific, we talked about this alpha criteria, which is specific to, it's one of those many drilling parameters, again, of which there are many.
Right.
Other manufacturers, other companies, kind of different ways that they think about it. Everyone seeks to normalize. You really can't look at, just as you're kind of alluding to.
Gotcha.
About torque, whatever that may be, or similar. In a CBT, you have to think about all sorts of things and normalize to something at some point. And so the noise in the industry right now is that there's a lot of different kind of ways that we all think it. And contractors, Keller, which is one of them, have their own proprietary parameters too. So I think some amount of transparency is required, especially within project teams, to say, this is what we're looking at. What are you looking at? I'm not sure how much transparency at this point is really between contractors, but I think it's getting there. As really a lot of this is being driven, as Ken has alluded to, by equipment manufacturers. A lot of this development.
Gotcha. Very good. Well, thank you very much. And so just want to wrap things up here for the first part of this session. We heard from our speakers this morning. There was, I know, one question, Tom Grumman, we will get to your question after the break here when we get into the big discussions. So just wanted to let you know, we haven't forgotten you in your question there. But thank you all speakers, great presentations, great lead in to the afternoon session, where we're going to be coming back after an hour break. So here in a few seconds, we'll break and come back at 2 o'clock. Derek is going to lead us off with a presentation that sort of ties a lot of this together. In fact, A-GaME concepts and what you heard today, and lead us into the discussion for the afternoon. But thank you all presenters, and don't forget, you have, so there is a poll going on. The poll will be continued this afternoon. So if you have not completed your poll questions, there will be an opportunity during the first part of the next session before we start our discussion to put your input in there and sort of help us steer the discussion for this afternoon. But thank you all. Please return here at 2 o'clock and we will start part 2. Take care. See you in a bit. Welcome back, everybody, or welcome if you're just joining us. You are now in part 2 of our Super Summer Session number 3, which is focusing on the communication aspects of communicating subsurface conditions for construction specifically. As you we've been talking about, these summer sessions have been focused on constructability and construction specifically, and the fact that we do have this issue of focusing very specifically early on on our immediate needs and not necessarily doing subsurface investigations that our contractors need for construction and for bidding purposes. So we are bridging the gap for this session 3 today. So we had great speakers this morning: Jim Morrison with STV, Steve Say with Kiewit, Alan Cadden with Snubble Engineering, and Ken Ness and John Gill with Keller. We are leading into our discussion portion for today. So our guest speakers are going to join us today. We also have an additional guest speaker who represents the owner perspective, and that's Sarah McGinnis from PennDOT. And I'll go ahead and introduce her, and she will come on later during the discussion. But Sarah McGinnis is a senior assistant construction engineer with Pennsylvania Department of Transportation's District 6, which includes Philadelphia and the 4 surrounding counties. Prior to her position or current position, she spent 25 years in the geotechnical unit, with 13 of those years spent as the district geotechnical engineer. So our first presenter today and also a host and will be leading our discussion today is Derek Dossenbrock. Derek is a geotechnical engineer with the US DOT Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center, and he joined us in April of 2020. And Derek, since that time, has been essentially a co-lead for the A-GaME, as you probably know, and has also been engaged in projects related to geotechnical data communication, visualization, exchange, and interoperability. And he's working with groups within TRB, DFI, and the ASE Geo Institute on those topics. He currently is participating in Open Geospatial Consortium's Geotechnical Interoperability Experiment, which intends to extend the OGC and BIM standards. So with that, I am going to let Derek take the floor.
Cool, thanks, Ben. All right, we'll work on sharing the appropriate screen here. And with any luck, this will be working properly. Looks like it is. All right, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Ben, for the introduction. My presentation today is going to be, as Ben described, a lead-in to our panel discussion from our morning speakers. So my topic is about data visualization and about integration. And the thoughts here are that we are rapidly moving toward what I would call a digital data life cycle for transportation projects. And this certainly includes geotechnical data, as well as all the other information that you are going to need to build a project successfully. So first, the disclaimers. Except for any statutes or regulations cited, the contents of the presentation do not have the force and effect of law and are not meant to bind the public in any way. This presentation is intended only to provide information regarding existing requirements under law or agency policies. Secondly, U.S. government does not endorse products, manufacturers, outside entities, trademarks, names, and logos that appear in the presentation or because they're considered essential to the objective of the document. They're included for informational purposes and are not intended to reflect preference, approval, endorsement of any one product or entity. So with the fine print out of the way, let's look at some advice from 3 of our geotechnical legends. Carl Terzaghi said that further progress depends chiefly on the improvement of our methods for measurement in the field, scope and quality of field observations, and the adaptation of the methods of subsoil exploration to practical requirements. It's interesting that that has not changed that much over time. the A-GaME has been all about improving our methods and methodology. Another legend, Ralph Peck, had mentioned that geotechnical engineering remains the most onerous of subdisciplines of civil engineering because it requires the most professional judgment. And engineering judgment needed to make reasonable assumptions comes from experience. And I think everybody appreciates that no two project sites are the same. They can even differ in time if you come back to the same project site later. So there certainly are things that you need to know in geoengineering that are altogether important for a successful project. And I like this one from H. Bolton Seed. If you're smart, you'll operate it better than the minimum standards. We have a lot of standards and requirements that set prescriptive minimums, but we may find it advantageous to do more than the minimum. I'm going to go through several topics with you today. One of them is a sort of a recap of the A-GaME, how that plays a role in concepts related to variability, constructability, and risk. Through the aspects of communication and visualization. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about data exchange, recapping what Alan Cadden talked about in the first part of this session, and then a little bit about how all that ties into achieving performance, which is really the design goal for our transportation structure, and productivity, which gets to aspects of constructability. We've talked a lot over the past several years about the A-GaME and its mission of promoting effective exploration methods, practices, and technologies with proven potential. They've been used before, they're not new. We just feel that they're still underutilized in the profession in US practice. These newer methods often help add quality, accelerate project delivery, reduce cost, and improve the reliability and performance. Often, they are providing us fast, high quality, and digital data. We'll talk more about that soon. Many are safer than traditional rotary drilling practices. That's often sort of an unsung aspect of some of these techniques, which probably should get more credit than it often does. Geophysical techniques are particularly well suited to areas with difficult site access. All of the techniques are cost effective, and they can generally be provided with local consulting services or certainly regional, and often with experience, again, they can be performed very effectively in-house by an owner or agency. So in addition to the things that we typically think of, cost, time, quality, improved geotechnical data really leads to what I'll call right-sized foundations. Less conservatism leads to reduced construction materials in some cases and the time to construct. You can think if your facility is optimally designed, you aren't bringing in excesses of concrete and steel and having to deal with all the trucks hauling material in or taking excavated material out, which also has impacts for sustainability. Appropriate means and methods and bids also means that you're paying for the right amount of work associated with your project. A lot of the information, if it can go and be acquired ahead of time, improves bidding documents. Contractors are all bidding on the same thing. They're bidding on, I'll say, the correct scope of work for what you're trying to do without an appreciable level of, say, conservatism or redundancy that is out of balance with the rest of the work. This also means that there's reduced potential for work stoppages, changes in plans later on, contract amendments, so we can think of all the administrative burden that's involved, but also delays in the progress of the other work. Geotechnical works often come at the very beginning of a project, so you can imagine that any overruns have follow-on effects for the rest of the project. So we've talked about our game changers, the underutilized methods. We've primarily focused on several of these, but there's certainly a lot of others, and we've helped states implement a number of them that haven't been the 4 key areas, which I'll discuss shortly here. Oops. So cone penetration testing is one of our featured A-GaME technologies. More reliable parameters than traditional standard penetration testing. Small stratification changes are more easily discernible. You get pore water pressure measurements. With added modules, you can get video and seismic measurements. The seismic measurements being especially useful if you're doing seismic design because they are direct measurements of the wave speed. through the ground, and it's faster than conventional drilling. So you can get more information in an equivalent amount of time, and it often can complement other technologies. Geophysics, there are a number of different methods for mapping contrasting materials and groundwater conditions over large areas, and this information can be used to fill in the gaps between our borings or soundings very efficiently. Measurement while drilling is a technology that's been in use in Europe and by several states now for a number of years. But recently, a number of states are taking interest in it for everything from primary geotechnical evaluation to helping with the installation and understanding of intermediate geomaterials and rocks for drilled shaft and other deep foundations specifically. Similar to the CPT, it provides a continuous measurement profile with discernible stratigraphic and material changes. It's a lot less sensitive toward driller subjectivity. Can be used in materials where the CPT is not appropriate. So a lot of information can be gained by using MWD techniques. And we've talked about these a little less frequently than some of our other topics through the A-GaME, but acoustic and optical televiewers certainly have relevance for rock information. Continuous high resolution, spatially oriented images can provide information on in-place rock structure and voids. It eliminates some of the problems with oriented coring or coring in very soft rocks, or if you have a lot of voids or gaps. And it's independent of the RQD and core recovery. It also provides a digital image, which a lot of times is easier to share with folks rather than having contractors come and look at rock boxes at a owner agency facility. The last several sessions have focused on constructability, and Ben's done a good job explaining what some of those conditions are. But certainly in geoengineering, we have to be mindful that the design and function of the structure that we're building is often what rightfully has our attention as geotechnical designers. But there's also a need in many cases to examine, is that foundation buildable? Are we using the right techniques to implement and construct our foundation design? Are there problems with variability, with groundwater, with site access, and other conditions? So we have to make sure that we think of that as well about building our facility, since we don't have the opportunity to wish things into place. We've talked a little bit about acceleration of design and construction, that this plays a role in both traditional design bid build work, but it also plays an outsized role in accelerated bridge construction, as well as design build and CMGC CMAR projects. So involving the geotechnical discipline early is important, and getting information ahead of time can provide future time of construction advantage, even while you're still in the pre-design and final design phases. As with project management, the earlier you know something, the more successful implementing change will be. We have to, sort of respect the fact too, that it is sometimes difficult to engage with all the people that we need to say, hey, this project has some extra geotechnical considerations on it. A lot of times there's a boilerplate process. So some of the ways in which we can make sure other stakeholders are aware of the importance of some of the geotechnical aspects of projects are providing them data early that's meaningful to them. So the A-GaME tools are fast. They provide digital data, and this is especially useful in data exchange and now for inclusion in BIM, digital twins, digital as-built, but also for visualization and exchanging data with our colleagues during the design phase, as well as external stakeholders in case there are decisions to be made along the line, say if we're even in a very early stage for selecting an alignment where it might be possible to avoid a problematic area very early in the project. Alan did a great job talking about the evolving digital geotechnical workflow, EDC 6 after EDC 5, where the A-GaME sits. Talked about e-ticketing and digital as-built. We've mentioned DIGS, Digital Interchange Standard. And I'd also like to mention AASHTO's provisional standard, PP 102-20. Technical subcommittee developed this document, and so it's an option for transportation agencies right now to specify the use of the DIGS standard for digital interchange and interoperability. And right now, people who've been working on the DIGS standard and framework for a number of years are also actively participating with international organizations, the Open Geospatial Consortium and Building Smart International. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming slides. There was a question from part one that asked some questions about DIGS. So as Alan mentioned, it's a GML application, so it inherits a lot of properties from geographic markup languages, consists of these objects, and the objects have properties. And with any luck, you'll never need to know about it. You can think of it as needing to understand the code for the way your digital television receives its signals to encode and decode information. It's there, it's important, but it's really not something that the average user needs to know. It is, however, important that the developers know how to use it and implement it. And there is growing interest, and there is a lively community to develop these objects and these properties and how everything is named and inheritance rights and a whole bunch of other things to make the relationships sensible so that a computer understands what's going on. And the illustration at the left just shows how you would start describing, say, a triaxial sample. You would have a borehole. The borehole would need to be located in space with the X, Y, Z coordinates for where it exists. You may then have a string of data talking about how the boring progresses and gets to a location, which is then sampled. The sample then may have specimens. The specimens may have a number of tests. You can see where I'm going. There's a lot of information that might need to be encoded for a particular bit of information. But once all that is established, and everybody is using the same nomenclature, then software programs know where to look, they speak a common language, and you don't need to define that again or for each individual user because everybody's using the common language. A number of conversion tools already exist today for exchanging data back and forth using correspondence files, and or you can think of it as the Rosetta Stone, right, for language importing and exporting. As long as we know what something means in one language, we can change it to another, in this case, DIGS, and we're then able to import and export information. So why do we want to do that? The key is really interoperability. What we are looking for is a way to exchange the data that does not require some sort of human interaction of pulling the data out, telling somebody what it means. You can think of if I had to send a spreadsheet and explain what was in every column or row. Well, DIGS does that automatically. So your on-site logging tablet can load in information into your boring logs and your field software, which can go into your design and analysis software, which then can talk to your CAD software, and maybe that goes into your transportation asset management plan, or maybe it interfaces with your lab software or real-time sensing data. Maybe that goes on your GIS maps, or perhaps in your BIM software, or maybe you exchange it with external customers, clients, stakeholders, contractors. If everything is interoperable, then all of this happens seamlessly in the background. And what can you do with it once it's there? Well, we have a number of applications that are currently in development. Some of them are related to assessing the variability. You can think of coefficient of variation or how regular some of the data is. We're now actively having users take a look at AI and machine learning for adaptation of being able to pick out layers of interest and or layers for essentially auto-picking certain characteristics or something that we're looking for in our soil profile. and potentially providing information on what's happening between boreholes. So you can think of a lot of geostatistics and kriging and a whole lot of other information that we're hopeful will be available to you in software packages shortly. Alan showed a map. This was from the Geoseta tool. I took a quick screen grab of some of the information that was in there and represented in March of 2022. You can take a look. We had some projects in Ohio and Tennessee in that program software. And this is what the map looks like in August of 2022. So that area in the middle US has expanded greatly. And we're imagining that with time and people sharing their data, that this map will become even more populated in the near future. So I often say the future is arriving, but really the future is here. DIGS XML is beginning to now actively benefit the communication of geotechnical data. Several state DOTs are using it. They have exported into DIGS, and there are a number of developers that are looking at building DIGS into their platforms, either for borehole, lab data, instrumentation data, CAD architecture. And this all plays an important role for data management and for asset management generally. Also, Steve this morning mentioned the importance of getting geotechnical data in an electronic format so that contractors can work with it efficiently as opposed to paper or PDF copies of the logs of static information. And we're looking at using some of this data not only at the project level, but also at what you would call the program or the enterprise level. The information can be used for reliability design calibrations, think LRFD resistance factors, as well as a host of other technologies that rely on large data sets. E-construction and digital delivery is happening now. Transfer of electronic plans, especially 3D plans. A lot of Department of Transportation are looking toward you see it out in the field when people are doing surveying, but mobile devices, software, and other field applications are becoming increasingly common. We now have data hosting services, data in the clouds, shared sites, electronic review and approval for documents and signatures, and different communication tools where things are automatically uploaded to websites rather than trading around email with spreadsheets. And all of this is starting to be seen certainly in the realm of asset management with electronic as-builts. So visualization. It improves communication and stakeholder understanding, which is important because it helps convey information quickly and effectively so that everybody has the same picture. And you can imagine that this sort of collaboration is important both internal to your organization and externally. New collaboration and communication tools. Alan talked about the HoloLens technology taking information which was previously on, say, 11 by 17 black and white plan sheets, and now taking it and displaying it holographically in a 3D environment where users are able to collaborate, move around, move the design drawing in 3D, move it up, down, sideways, look around, point at things, and observe conflicts in 3 dimensions. You'll be able to see if that pipeline happens to go through your foundation, or if the foundations happen to be a little too close for comfort to that slope that you didn't really recognize when you were doing the initial design. Things that can be seen when you don't have a cross section that happens to be the critical cross section. If typically maybe you only cut a cross section every 50 feet or so, and something was happening, interesting at 75+2, now you'll be able to see that sort of information somewhat easier. A quick little foundation selection example. Seismic cone penetration tests were used to evaluate the soil stiffness for a project in Minnesota, which was originally conceived as a piling project. It was determined that the soil was adequately strong and stiff so that it would meet the serviceability requirements of less than 1 inch of settlement. So a change in the design was made, and there was a small platform built underneath the footings with a fabric wrap in case some overzealous ditch diggers came around front. The soil under the footings would remain in place. And you can imagine that the information for that project might be easier to see in 3D space than in 2D space. So this was one of the projects that we had used. If you had the benefit of attending any of the A-GaME summits or seeing some of the information, which we've had a number of presentations online and also showed off at some recent conventions. Visualization can be used really in any project phase for great effect, whether or not you're doing scoping and planning, choosing alternatives for preliminary design. It's important to both geotechnical, structural, and construction and hydraulics and other disciplines. Important certainly in final design, and when you're sharing information with project and construction managers, decision makers, and certainly with bidders and contractors. Building information modeling is here. It is very common in what I'll call the vertical space for buildings, and it is increasingly common for horizontal construction, especially if you have complicated structures. If you think about curved steel bridges or alignments which wind through areas or are in dense urban environments or have a long set of bridges, maybe rather than just one. It's a set of technologies. It's beyond just 3D CAD. It contains more and more project information, and the virtual model can be shared, used, adapted, exchanged among stakeholders in the project. A vernacular for it is a digital twin. The information can be dynamic. You can put information in at various processes during construction to take snapshots as new structures are actually built and look at how things change with time. And it becomes a resource for information. What are the physical parameters of the beams that were shipped? What are the heat numbers of the steel? When did the piling arrive? When did you perform various operations on site? So you can think of it including information that's useful for inspection, for cost, for schedule, as well as just the nuts and bolts of the CAD design itself of where everything goes in space. So applications are growing both nationally and internationally. For BIM, why is that important for us in transportation? Well, AASHTO has adopted what they call Administrative Resolution AR1-19. So it's the adoption of industry foundation classes, or the IFC schema, as the standard design schema for the exchange of electronic and engineering data. So you'll be seeing more of it because AASHTO has 2 pooled fund studies, one for bridges and structures and one for other design elements, but they're looking to make these industry foundation classes and essentially BIM a standard deliverable from the designers to the contractors, fabricators, and others. So this is active and in process. And as BIM matures, you'll be hearing, I imagine, much more about the IFC data schema and different file formats. Drivers: increased quality, faster project production, fewer change orders, easier project administration. This is a roadmap of a number of states that were involved in the transportation pooled fund study for bridges. How does the A-GaME fit into that? Well, we're all about cost, schedule, constructability, risk, and reliability. It all plays into this idea of communication, visualization, and collaboration. This evolving role in digital project delivery. And part of the geotechnics is the whole process and the life cycle. It also has implications for some of the things that are going on with the bill, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. You can think that providing information early and having access to it provides additional resources for people that are considering aspects of projects related to equity, sustainability, and resilience. The more information you have, the better you can look at those particular aspects of construction. So, bridging the gap, the topic for today. The location, type, and quality and quantity of measurements do have a significant influence in the appropriateness and reliability of the parameters we use. This is important for geotechnical design, just within our local process as geotechnical engineers, It's important for bidding the project well and correctly. It's important during construction, relating back to those constructability issues, and then for the overall project life cycle. So not only when it's delivered on day one, but also through its intended design life. This standardized geotechnical data exchange through DIGS and BIM IFC is going to be transforming our workflows significantly in the next few years, and certainly computer processes in our field and industry are going to need to talk to one another in order to make sure that all of our data is transferred and imported correctly, and that the geotechnical information is right there in the project documents with all the other design information. So bring your A-game to the digital present. Use a variety of tools and processes so that we can develop an appropriate understanding of the conditions that influence the project design and performance, as well as constructability, and do recognize and prepare for our move to the digital future of geotechnical practice. We are a component part of the whole digital construction workflow and asset management, and it's not coming, it's already here. So you're likely to see it soon. In places more than summer session 3. So if you can say you saw it here first, maybe so much the better, you'll be prepared for it. Otherwise, don't be surprised if in a next presentation at your owner agency, they start talking about BIM and the digital workflow. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to lead us into our panel discussion. And we will head there straight away. So with that, I'll invite our panelists from this morning and we'll begin our discussion. So the super session is intended to be a series of presentations and practical discussion based on the personal professional experience of the presenters. The viewpoints expressed are those of the individuals speaking and not those of the Federal Highway Administration or its contractors. And the presentation will be recorded and posted for future viewing. So we welcome back Jim, Steve, Alan, Ken, John, and added Sarah and myself into the mix. So I will, let's see, stop the screen share and we will begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Okay, so I'm going to start off actually with a question to Steve, because something intrigued me about something that you mentioned in your presentation about hammer calibration. And I think it was for seismic considerations in particular, but also about groundwater. I guess, did I understand that you felt that in some projects those weren't characterized particularly well? Because that seems like information that I would think everybody should be doing today. So if you had any additional thoughts, maybe to expand on some of those issues.
Well, the first component is, yes, we see projects across the country where the hammer energy is unknown. And it would be my belief that for this group is just for everyone to recognize, if you are driving a split spoon and you're looking to do seismic related evaluations, you have to have a recently calibrated hammer. So I would just believe that each of the agencies just need to look to say, are they providing that information? Is it on the log? It's very important. And then the second thing in past questions, I mean, of the projects that we see, a definition of the groundwater level is probably very poorly provided. It's certainly not unusual at all to see a boring that is drilled, it's under traffic, and the boring's grouted or backfilled immediately. And there's no information whatsoever regarding where the groundwater level is. And in particularly large construction projects, construction dewatering can be a very important part of shoring design or how you're going to build a bridge foundation. And our experiences is that the groundwater information is sparse or maybe not there at all.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, that sounds like some low-hanging fruit that would be, you know, easy for folks to pick up and provide a lot of extra value there.
Derek, just a quick question to follow up on that. Steve, when you say the calibration of the hammers, are you referring to true energy measurement on the SPT system, or just knowing whether it's an auto hammer versus safety hammer?
Well, we certainly see some logs as to where it doesn't say what the hammer was. It would say that it would be that the test was done in accordance with the ASTM, was it 1586? But we certainly see reports where there is no recognition of what the hammer energy is, and much less whether it's been calibrated recently. So it's extremely important in my belief that as we're preparing documents that needs to be in the report somewhere.
Cool. So I'm going to talk about the poll questions in just a moment, but I did want to ask Alan for a couple of future thoughts as we lead in. So, you know, we talked a bit about digital data. So, Alan, you know, I'm aware that, say, Pennsylvania DOT has an initiative that by 2025, they're looking to do all of their construction documents as 3D digital technology, no longer using construction plans. It's called the PennDOT Digital Delivery Directive. Do you see other states moving toward that? And you know, how do you feel based on your involvement with DIGS? Do you think we are ready for something like that in the geotechnical community, basically in 3 years' time?
Good question. I think as far as an official statement of digital 3D by 2025, Pennsylvania is the only one I'm aware of. Congratulations, Sarah. But you know, I think within a couple of years we're going to be ready. We have the ability to transfer data now. We have a lot of interest from vendors and users in, you know, a lot more awareness and interest in DIGS now than there has been for the last 15 years. So it feels like the advancement is happening quickly now. There's a lot of investment, a lot of interest that I think in a year or two, we'll be fully capable of doing what we want to do in DIGS and have a lot of vendors and tools available to utilize it.
Okay. All right, and I guess to round out the intro questions to Ken and John, I noticed that on the Minnesota DOT project, there were both cone soundings and SPT tests involved that you were able to compare the measurements of the ground improvement with. Do you have a preference when you're doing that for CPT, for SPT, for both?
Certainly preference is CPTs. I think a lot of us think in terms of SPT data still, unfortunately. So it's easier for us to sort of know how a 10 blow or 20 blow sand performs. You know, I kind of have those metrics in my head, and it's harder for me to look at a CPT, and you know, I still look at that sort of as squiggly lines until I kind of like analyze enough of them. But certainly once you know, for a quick look, SPTs are a little faster. Eventually, we kind of always need CPT data at this point to really get smart about it.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of interesting
I totally agree.
All right, cool.
Oh. Sorry, yeah, I agree with John. We've been seeing over the last 4 or 5 years more and more CPT data on our projects, and that's definitely, you know, I'm more on the design side of the work that we do, and John's more on the construction side of it. I know from the design side and the quality side, I like the CPT data better as well.
Yeah, I was going to interject. I found it or find it kind of interesting that it takes rather a while for institutional change, and I will admit that when I was first doing design work, I had the benefit of learning about cone data and SPT data about the same time, and I've always had a preference for cone data. I actually found it somewhat more understandable. I don't think I ever inherently thought that like 5 blow or 7 blow or 9 blow material, that I had any more of a feeling for that than I did for 100 PSI on the cone or 300. Or actually, when I was doing a lot of data, I got to understand, oh, hey, the clays in Minnesota have about this performance and the sands this. And I found cone data to make more sense actually in some of the sandy soils, because when you had blow counts that were all over the place and you saw the cone data, it was like, oh, well, maybe the depositional history is doing that and there is, potentially some rhyme or reason. Additionally, in one of our very first projects that I worked on, getting to what Steve was talking about the importance of hammer calibration, there were 2 drill rigs by the owner on a project, and they were leapfrogging one another, progressing down this causeway. And it was very peculiar, the information we were getting, because the stratigraphy seemed very uniform. But one of the drill rigs was reporting layers that I'll just use like 510, 510, 510 all the way down. And the other drill rig was reporting something along the lines of like 816, 816, 816. And so it was like, well, that's really weird, because the stratigraphy from both of those was like spot on, but there was a difference in the numbers that were coming out. And it turned out that one rig had been calibrated and was about 60% efficient, and the other one was about 85% efficient. So you had to recognize that the numbers needed some modification, and both drill rigs were saying the same thing, but not giving you the same raw numbers off the drill rig. So that's actually when we realized that we needed to do the energy calibrations on the drill rigs. But it took that real world experience for us to say, hey, not all these numbers are real, or maybe they are real, but we need to figure out what they really mean. Which I do have to admit clouded my own judgment when somebody was like, I know what 8 blows is. And I was like, well, do you? It could be 5 blows, depending upon what how your rig is calibrated. So, Sarah, any thoughts from the owner perspective before we head off into the poll questions?
Yeah, I mean, like others, we did SPT for decades and decades. And I slowly learned, we started doing some major corridor projects along I-95, which in Philadelphia is adjacent to the Delaware River. So you have stratigraphy that we weren't used to seeing. We encountered running sands, and somebody suggested we do CPT. And now we do it as a matter of course, especially on some of those larger, very, very large projects. And I think the data that it provides, including groundwater data and pore pressure data, is invaluable to optimizing design. And I did want to add, I think groundwater came up the last time we had this conversation. And one of the things that we struggle with is not just having to dewater, but also in a lot of our urban areas, anything we dewater has to be treated. And talk about doubling or tripling the expense of something. If we can just stay just above that groundwater and however we need to do that, that's a really important aspect of understanding. And of course, it's tidal. We have the groundwater going up and down every day. So you need to know where it is the highest at any given location for construction.
Cool.
I have a question for Sarah before you dive into the poll questions. And this is a little more back to the digital data question, but as PennDOT is kind of moving into committing to being completely digital delivery, what specific steps are you taking internally? I mean, I know there's a lot to it, but like, are there sort of general changes that you're making in terms of who you're involving in the process of getting your data out there and being able to work with it and develop sort of programs, scripts or whatever to work with it? Like, what big picture changes are you making in your organization to actually make that happen?
So unfortunately, I'm not the gal to answer that question. PennDOT, unlike a lot of other states, is decentralized. So our central office group, which has this initiative, works out of Harrisburg, and then we all work in districts. So things are sort of trickling down, and what they're actually doing as an initiative to move forward with this, we won't really know until they've made their decisions and have something implemented that we can use.
Okay, so it's kind of being driven from the top to like
Yeah.
develop systems to make it happen. Because it's not like this just automatically happens just because the tools are out there. Like you have to make the tools work for you. And I feel like that's can be one of the big challenges for going from theory to reality with this stuff.
Yeah, and we have a terrific group in central office that's I'm sure going to make sure that, you know, there's 11 districts, so you have 11 different geotechnical engineers doing things 11 different ways and wanting things 11 different ways. So, you know, that's sort of where the centralization helps, because they're like, this, we've worked with you and determined this is the best path forward, and, you know, let's have some training and have at it.
Cool. Well, I'm excited to see how that develops for you guys. You'll be an example for sure. All
Yeah,
right, Derek, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I know there was a question to Alan about the visualization, and speaking as, you know, someone who practices and has, you know, I think our program in our district is it's 2 billion, I think, in construction, but being able to see something that you could never see before, I think is going to be a game changer for the practitioners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All right, we did have a question come in about GBRs, but I think it will probably flow nicely into the poll question discussions also, Derek. So why don't you get started with those?
All right, sounds good. Let's see. Quickly before we dive into the poll, Juan had a question. How many states provide geotechnical baseline reports for structures? Was that the one you were going to ask that you said I should save? We are a well-coordinated machine.
It's okay. We're so well-coordinated. Go ahead. It's fine.
No, we'll go with that. So and then I'll reorder the poll questions. We'll drive into GBRs to start us out. So how many states provide GBRs for structures other than tunnels? Thoughts?
One.
Crickets?
Well, I can say, you know, obviously the reports that we saw in Hawaii, and we certainly see some form of a GBR in Washington State. So those would be the two that I have experience with.
Speaking from my little corner of Pennsylvania, we don't habitually provide reports. Of course, we always provide test boring logs, and we'll include CPT data, you know, as an addendum to the contract. Although we have done it, I spoke of some of those very large corridor projects. We have provided additional geotechnical information and analysis to contractors, but I don't think we do it as a practice in Pennsylvania.
And I'm not sure they're specifically always called geotechnical baseline reports. I mean, unless there's that formal distinction, but I do know that some owners, I'll say, provide additional information. I think Wisconsin DOT talked about a design package with additional information that maybe didn't take the form of I'll say the legal implications of a GBR, but were essentially you know, a lot more geotechnical information than simply the plans and specifications, which is, you know, common. And I believe that a number of owner agencies provide additional information for what I'll call complex structures. So if you're doing like a large underground chambers rather than tunnels, or if you're building a dam or hydraulic facility in the case of the Corps of Engineers or other things, they're probably much more common wherever you have additional geotechnical complexity in some form or other.
Yeah, we have, I'm sorry, and I know the Pennsylvania Turnpike has, because they're a separate agency from us, provided something called, I believe, a geotechnical treatment plan. So it's like above and beyond the plan set and just the boring logs, and it's specifically lays out more detailed geotechnical information.
Alan, in your experience, have you know, obviously tunnels has traditionally been, you know, an area where GBRs have been used, but where are you seeing, actually, you know, from Keller's perspective too, are you seeing it just in tunnels, or are you seeing it in other transportation areas as well?
I think just real quickly, I think most of what I would say we see is maybe more advanced geotechnical data reports.
Gotcha.
More compilation of the data,
yep.
But not necessarily more down to
Your sound just went out on me. I don't know. I didn't hear you.
Can you still hear me?
I can sort of. What was that last?
So I was just going to say, typically it's probably more of a more detailed geotechnical data report, not so much the baseline report.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think this is a pretty new concept. It's an underutilized tool for certain, and I certainly have been interested in seeing, just knowing what it provides, and knowing what information has been sort of published in it. I think there is a huge potential for us to use it effectively and more frequently. So I don't think it's the end of the story here that it hasn't been used. I think this is an opportunity for us to start looking at where it can be used effectively.
Okay. We had a comment in the chat about North Carolina DOT providing subsurface inventories for roadways, bridges, and retaining walls. And on the topic of baseline reports, for those that participated in the poll, we had just under 100 participants this morning and through the beginning of the session. Have you written, read, or otherwise been exposed to a GBR? And 2/3 of our attendees have done. So I think that's a rather impressive amount. Personally, I would have predicted somewhat fewer, so good to see. Jumping back to poll question 1, we asked whether or not people were familiar with the contents of ASCE's geoconstructability document, and around 10% of our audience had. So 9 of 98 were familiar. So we're glad that we could bring that document to your attention. And hopefully it will be an insightful read for those that weren't previously familiar with it. And we'll look at providing links to that from some of our sites and partner organizations. Just about a dead, actually, yes, 50-50 split, 49 versus 49 on poll question 3. Has your organization transferred digital geotechnical data, such as GINT files, CPT data files, to contractors for project use prior to bidding? So I think that's interesting to see. In my own practice, we transfer data quite frequently, either in Excel or Microsoft database or GINT formats, particularly for complex projects where we had cone data and other information. It was interesting, one of the questions in the morning talked about potentially problems with proprietary formats if you were sending something that maybe could only be read and that may be running afoul of other folks in your owner or agency. And that really is what DIGS is for, it being an industry standard protocol that is not tied to a proprietary format or vendor. So we're hoping that in the very near future, more folks will incorporate that, and it won't be any more difficult than importing from Excel, CSV, text, or other types of files. And a lot of progress is being made there. Turning to poll question 4, have you prepared or used subsurface visualization tools? 1/3 of you have, such as televiewers, 3D models, bedrock maps, to help inform contractors prior to bidding. So less common practice, 66% of folks said they had not. I'll turn to our panelists. Any of these poll questions or answers surprise you so far? Or do you have thoughts on any of the first 4?
There's a question in the box about making IT departments comfortable with sharing data. Maybe that factors into question 3 there. 50-50 of, can we give data or can't we? And that's become a question to a lot of the digs, user groups is, what liability goes along with sharing data, and how do I make sure it's reliable, or, what if somebody changes it and uses it incorrectly? I think they're all factors to be aware of, but the benefit of sharing data, using larger data sets, understanding the big picture a lot better, I think far outweigh those concerns. And, we are sharing data in many, many forms. So selectively picking and choosing and being scared of it, I think, is just holding us back.
Yeah, I think another point here, I mean, obviously, security and just accuracy of data. So, there always has to be a quality assurance side to the data and some way of checking that. But the reality of, public sector data is the fact that this is, information that is available to the public, really. It may not be, during the time of the project, but it is, this is information that's not ours. It's the taxpayer dollar. So it is, available, and quite frequently, DOTs get requested for information on boring. So it's not, unusual to share data. It's more of, having the measures in place for checking data and the protocols for housing and security for your purposes. So, people aren't messing with state data. But other than that, it is publicly available information.
So does anybody see a difference between sharing a PDF of a boring log or sharing a GINT file of a boring log? I know the IT people do, but in reality, it's data.
It is. And I would actually, if I were concerned with it, I'd be more concerned with sharing CPT data versus a PDF of a CPT file, which is really hard to duplicate. But people seem less concerned with sharing CPT data than like GINT files or whatever. Just, I think, because people think more about CPTs in terms of data, and I don't know, they just seem less wary of that for some reason. But that's an interesting question, because you could duplicate a PDF boring log very easily, like turn it into data,
and you can alter it as well.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting too, because a lot of state departments of transportation will share their templates in GINT. So those templates a lot of times have, the exact format that a log would be prepared in. So you have that access, and you could create a PDF of, a document every bit as easily as you could create an electronic file, for the document. So, to my mind, there are a lot of questions, certainly, but they are being answered by others. Digital signatures, stamps, watermarks, time coding, who has authority to update files and data transfer, and I think our geotechnical information is a lot less interesting than people give us credit for. And I've talked with a number of IT people and explained, it's like, our data does not contain any personally identifying information. It doesn't contain anything people would want, zip codes, phone numbers, salary rates, anything like that. And then I show them what it is, and they're like, oh, yeah, sure, they can have that. It's kind of interesting. I think everybody's very worried about it until they become more familiar with it, and then things seem to be okay.
So
we have ways to share CAD files. I mean, that's a lot more susceptible to change, I guess. But we get them to sign releases and recognize the hard copies are official.
So I've looked at it that the paper copy of a cone trace would be something like the boring log form, that there would be some interpretation of the stratigraphy that the reader could make with that. It really goes to the element that you need the digital data if you want to use the cone to generate some kind of an engineering property. You really need the digital data rather than trying to pull the numbers off of a scale that is just awful.
Right. You want to make it useful. You don't want to have the contractor trying to figure out with the triangles and engineering scales and typing the data back in. So, it's worth the owner's time to provide that information, because the contractor's, working for you to build the project. So giving the
I have a question for John and Ken. I'm curious, like from the standpoint, from your perspective as contractors who've been on a lot of ground improvement projects, thinking about the different bid packages you've been provided in terms of both data visualization and digital data, like what have been particularly useful formats that you've found that have helped you in bidding?
CPT data in Excel format is kind of becoming the standard for quick. I will clarify that, that tends to be for smaller building type projects, of which this may be less, applicable.
So private clients are actually giving those to you more than public clients, then you're saying. That's interesting.
But and certainly on a longer sort of lead project, a large DOT project, we tend to have a little bit more time to look at that anyway. And whether it's, just taking a little bit more time to really look through the CPT data and try to digitize it ourselves, it's also something.
And I'm assuming you guys have either like you've developed tools or have purchased tools to like process that very efficiently at this point, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it tends to be our own just sort of, Excel sheets like all of us have. Yeah. So, yeah.
But I feel like that's like ultimately what contractors could have the potential to do with Biggs files too. Like if they were able to have access to them regularly and develop systems to process them, that's what I see in the future.
Yes. Yeah, it'll be a shame if in 10 years we're still talking about what a 10-foot stand is, right?
But in the short term, if an Excel file with the data was available, that'd be a heck of a lot better than the squiggly line.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. The other thing I'd say is, the easier it is to transmit this information to the contractors who are trying to either do a delegated design, like what Keller is doing sometimes, or just figure out the constructability, the easier it is to transmit that data, the better it's going to be for us. Because I think, probably 99% of the projects that we see, DOT or otherwise, one of my questions for a project manager is, hey, we're missing this data. Can you ask for this or ask for that, right? So if there was a comprehensive way to transmit it, that would be great. Like one of the things, just for example, we haven't really talked about it here in terms of the exploration, but it is part of the exploration is lab data, right? Lab data can be so critical to assigning those engineering properties, comparing with the CPTs or comparing with the borings and just lining up the understanding of the project from 2 or 3 different pieces of information. So all those things, as you guys are talking about ways to share the information, I think it's really great.
And that actually reminds me of one of Steve's slides where, we talked about, groundwater, and you also talked about undisturbed sampling. And so I think it's worthy of pointing out, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are there, but on, the information that we get in situ and sort of the gold standard, laboratory type test, is there, some optimal type, numbers or relation between space and sampling that you if you were king for a day, would like to see?
Well, certainly, my experience traces back to Chuck Ladd at MIT. And the go-to test that we would always have would be in dealing with soft clays would be a one-dimensional odometer test. Relatively simple to do, not all that expensive, particularly if the laboratory is automated.
Right.
But in that, the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute has certainly been on the forefront of looking at, simple measurements like the strain on reloading to the effective overburden stress, as a way of being able to judge whether that consolidation test is disturbed or not. 20 some years ago when we did the I-15 work, the first thing we did was look at that and essentially threw out half of the odometer tests on $1 billion project. Now, you'd like to think that a $1 billion project would have good samples. The first thing we did was throw half of them out. Now, once we won the project, we went back in and did a variety of special sampling and went back in and did a variety of tests like that. But we've seen examples of where people have gone in and taken disturbed data and made somewhat really difficult decisions that were very costly because they were dealing with samples that they should have thrown away. Having no data was probably better than the data that they had.
And that is a fantastic point. The fact that it is this, the sample quality that makes or breaks the test. I mean, garbage in, garbage out on that.
But yet the first thing that we do would be to look at those strains on reloading and making a determination as whether we should consider the test or not. And there's a large number of the tests that the right answer is to throw them away.
Maybe adds to another point or plug for digs is part of the challenge we have is beyond understanding what units they are. Somebody gives you a spreadsheet with a bunch of CPT numbers in it. Do you really know what calculation went into calculating that parameter? Do you know what the units are correctly, or are we guessing? And having something like digs where there's an opportunity to capture, how the sample was collected, what the parameters are, what the test method was, all those kind of things, help reinforce the value of that data.
So in talking about data and exchanging it, just a quick question for our panelists. What digital data, have you seen transferred on a project, just generally? Have you been on a project where maybe they've provided grading information, digitally to the contractor, or a digital terrain model? I'll just throw it out there for anybody who may have some experience.
Certainly on the design build projects, there'll be a whole package of digital documents that will come with the RFP that will give you all of the topography information and the 30% plans. The geotechnical information oftentimes doesn't include the cone records, but on the design build projects, there's a pretty good sized package of AutoCAD drawings that will be part of the bid documents.
Okay. How about utility?
The geotechnical records are typically just a PDF of reports, not raw data.
Right.
Kind of a stack of boring logs.
Yeah.
Right, but I guess the point is that with our colleagues, in civil infrastructure, there are already precedents for exchanging digital information. It's not like we give the contractor, 12 reams of paper and say, here are the XY coordinates of the topography, all printed out on these sheets for you to then enter back in, on your own time. So, if we were to provide something like that, they would just be like, well, you guys are silly. This is going to be cost prohibitive, or they'd figure out some way, I suppose, to scan them with optical character recognition and import them all back in again. But, we shouldn't be afraid of providing digital information. That's already, being done. And to the extent that we need to figure out how to provide trust or verification or security or something, I think all of that are problems that are actively being worked on by our colleagues. So hopefully we will see more exchange of the digital information. And all of the metadata that comes with it. A good point about some of the consolidation tests. You can run them, in different methods, whether or not they're based on void ratio or strain rate or constant rate of consolidation versus incremental consolidation. The 12 or 15 different types of shear strength, depending upon what we use for those parameters. So a lot of opportunities to add value in just describing our data. Poll question 5, have you provided geotechnical monitoring or instrumentation data such as piezometers, inclinometers, or similar measures? 61% of our participants had, 39 had not. So a bit of a majority have actually provided monitoring data on some projects.
It's an interesting recent experience with that. We install all these instrumentation, but we don't always do a good job of explaining what they're there for. They need to have a purpose. We're there to measure something. And what's the criteria for acceptance or not acceptance? If we're waiting for consolidation of a preload, how are you going to determine when the time is up so the contractor knows what to do with the data and when he should be able to expect to move forward? So I think we could do a little better job of targeting instrumentation and explaining the purposes and use of it on projects.
Other than to run over it?
Well, yeah, that too.
I agree wholly with you, Alan. And if we do anything during design, we have to make sure that information gets translated in a usable and meaningful way to the contractor, not just a list of data points or, here's some printouts or here's an attachment to the plan set. You don't want to put too much in your special provision, but, by way of explanation, what this data means to construction is important.
All right, poll question 6 was, in your experience, communicating anticipated geotechnical conditions in pre-bid meetings as a means to minimize geotechnical issues during construction. And then it was several choices as to how effective it has been. In limited cases, it was not effective, 3%. 33% said that it had been only somewhat effective, followed by 31% of people who hadn't been involved. And then 27% said that it had been effective, and 7% highly effective. So a little bit of scatter in the data there. But I think for those that actually employed it, it was good to see that at least we're in the somewhat to effective category, with around double of very effective compared to not been effective. So it sounds like on balance, it's worth doing. In your experience using CMGC procurement as a means to minimize geotechnical related issues during construction, most people had not been involved, 64%, so only about a third of our folks have used CMGC, or CMAR, Construction Manager at Risk is another name for it, and a bit of an even distribution between somewhat effective and very effective, so a lot of varying experience there.
You got to remember, though, if you identify all those geotechnical risks during the design, it's going to drive the price up, and that makes the CMGC have a difficult time meeting the budget.
Unless the risks are real.
Well, they're real, but I'd rather find them out during construction when you already have the job, right?
No.
Well, there's a point in that, and it actually brings up, when we were updating the baseline report document, we talked about different methods, and one of the issues with baselines has been with design build, and the CMAR and other types of approaches they're really either all a function of the same issues of design build or the same issues of bid build, depending on how it goes. So I don't think that you change the risk profile at all by that construction path. Where you change it is if you're trying to fix a price before design is complete, or if you're trying to fix a price before the data is complete. You know, there's got to be a vehicle to adjust the pricing once more data comes into the picture in either design build, CMAR, any of those formats. That's really it comes down to a contractual issue more than a data issue. You still need the same data to both finish a design and finish a construction in any of the scenarios. The question is how you manage it contractually.
Yeah, and really CMAR just allows the owner to essentially control the engineer. And it's almost like an early contractor involvement situation as to where the contractor can provide input and somewhat of direction of what the critical components are. But you know, if you don't have good geotechnical information in a CMAR project, you're kind of stuck through there. So it's still whatever the contract mechanism is. The basic thing is getting a good characterization of the ground conditions.
But you do
having it communicated.
Steve, yeah, I'd like to add on one point is the early contractor involvement, which is actually a very big benefit to get a contractor involved during the design sequence. And how you manage it contractually has a couple of options, but to get that input in place as, for example, as the geotechnical baseline report is written, really helps identify where the dollar questions are and helps you focus the data that you need to answer the high dollar questions first. So big proponent of however you get there, early contractor involvement.
And early geotechnical engineer involvement.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I mean, certainly in private practice, you know, the elements would be is where you can get into a project very early. You can affect the outcome and be able to get a better project. It's where the geotechnical engineer comes in at the 11th hour and all these decisions have been made. And you have all these difficulties about being able to change the outcome.
Yeah.
Just adding from Keller's perspective, that early involvement tends to make the projects go more smoothly. I think to the point that you guys are making, right? Those risks are identified up front, and then the money can be spent and the effort can be spent on the things that are challenges to the construction, not just to the design, right? And it helps make the process smoother the whole way through.
Yes, as far as I know, PennDOT doesn't do CMGC. We're strictly low bid, but we have done some design build projects. And, you know, there's a couple options laid out in our design manual about how much geotechnical investigation we do prior to letting the project. And I've just always practiced that we should absolutely do a complete and full investigation as if we were designing it ourselves or having a consultant design it, because the costs of running into problems in construction just simply far outweigh any amount of investigation, even if you do an overkill investigation.
Well, and I would second that, because the information is available after the bid and you can start incorporating it directly. Otherwise, if you only have 20% of the information, your design team now gets to spend 1 month or 4 months going out and getting that information. And anytime an agency can get it early is a positive thing. Now, that design builder may go in and say, I need 5 borings at these locations. We missed this. That's a far better situation knowing at 20% of the locations what you got to deal with.
All right. What was on your slide, Ben? 50% of problems in construction are geotechnical, and I feel like that's simply just because of unknowns.
Yeah.
You would never say, put a beam in this size, but we don't know how strong it is. That's ludicrous.
Right. And the fact that we do, it's what 0.0 1% or whatever, that's a percent, 1/100th of a percent of the data is sensed, tested, or sampled, and you don't see that in other professions. You certainly wouldn't see that in the medical industry.
Well, and compare that with how many cylinders we take on one deck pour.
Right. Concrete bricks, yeah.
Tubs and tubs and tubs of them. So.
Yeah, and the fact that we're doing 1 to 3% of our project cost. So the more and more we talk about this, it certainly is becoming more apparent to me anyway. And one of the poll questions earlier had to do or asking, where is that problem? I think that was in the last session, and it was more on the timing side. Projects are being pushed out quickly, and getting that data within the time frame. So there's got to be a way of streamlining that aspect up front, getting those geotechnical engineers involved early in the project, and getting them in sort of the critical path there.
And Ben, having an organizational structure that supports that philosophy.
Right.
I mean, there certainly are organizations that say, I want to get as many jobs as possible out this year. I don't want to lose our let money,
Right.
and
Right.
I don't care what corners we have to cut. I mean, that's not very often, but it exists. It happens.
Right.
I've seen it, and I've been very fortunate to, have that kind of support. I'm not sure everyone does.
Well, and that's one of the things that we've tried to point out with the A-GaME, in that say, for example, if you use cone penetration testing or geophysics to supplement your borings, you don't need to slow down the process to do a better job. If anything, there's some possibilities that you might be able to expedite the process. And Sarah, I thought it was interesting, your comparison in talking about the concrete testing. I actually used that analogy in order to reinforce the importance of doing some spread footing monitoring, because there were a number of people like, well, we don't instrument those, we just don't do it. And it's like, well, why should we pay this cost? And it's like, this cost is actually less than you pay, for the material testing on your concrete for performance. So, when they realized that the cost was comparative, it's like, well, maybe Derek isn't asking for something, wholly unreasonable to determine the performance of shallow foundations. So I thought your comment there was kind of interesting.
All data is good and important data, all of it, no matter how much or little it costs.
Well, so to that question, sort of a free-for-all for anybody, have you ever been involved in a project where there was too much data?
Yes, actually.
Okay.
Well,
tell us about it.
I mean, it had to do with sensitive buildings in urban environment, setting monitoring points all up and down this building, realizing later that the movement associated with the sun coming up and going down was way more than we were seeing from the ground movement, and it was just clouded in the middle of just natural background. That's just too much data.
That's really important to know. So everybody listening will now think about that going forward. These are the kinds of things we have to share.
Well, right. And
we actually had an excavation support system with that same problem, that you shoot it with a survey gun and you get an eighth of an inch back and forth every day, and you think the surveyor is horrible. You put an AMTS up there and you realize every time the sun comes up, the building expands. Go figure.
At least if you have the data, you can see those trends. Whereas if you take like one reading at a random time of day per month, you're like, what's happening with my groundwater? What's happening with my wall movement?
Sure.
So there's also that.
Point.
Yeah. Well, it is an interesting point with measurements like that. I had a project where we were trying to determine pore water pressure decay in order to do staged construction loading to monitor how quickly the embankments were settling. We'd also installed shape arrays to determine the settlement, but we were trying to figure out why the piezometers were all wonky, and it was because it was next to a river, and the river level was going up and down and biasing the results from the consolidation process. So it's like, so next time we threw a piezometer over in the river so that we could correct for that sort of thing. But yes, the secret lives of foundations, there's a whole lot more moving and shaking going on even without seismic activity than I think anybody gives our structures credit for.
That's the name of the next the session after this. That's what you have to call it.
But
I think the other part of that is we collect data on every single foundation element, and 800 concrete tests, and all kinds of downhole sampling or whatever, and it gives a lot of fodder for everybody to overanalyze projects.
That's right.
And you think about the history of, we never knew how bad or how variable the conditions were before, but now because we collect all this data, we're overanalyzing it and increasing the expectations on the construction process.
So
we have to be more reasonable.
So I can
Go
think
ahead.
of one instance where we had too much data, and that would have been a major bridge project with lots of soft clay and 100 measurements of weight of rod, weight of hammer don't do you any good.
Yeah.
You're consistent.
It's like 50 feet of 50 overs. It's completely useless information.
So I have seen also, like with televiewer data, and heard from a lot of people, you get a lot of data, and you've got to figure out what's significant and what's not. And from that aspect, you've got a new problem, and it's not necessarily a bad problem, but you do have the problem of determining what is significant and what is not. So it's I think a good problem actually to have that type of data and being able to find out what is good, but it is, it's onerous. It can be onerous.
Well, and that's where I forget if it was Terzaghi or Peck's quote about experience becomes even more critical.
Right.
You can't just come in and practice and wave your hands around and say, oh, we have to compensate for all of these different unknowns and anomalies.
I had a comment in the chat, too much data, which led to significantly over-conservative deep foundation design. So I think, that's sort of an interesting point. I'll ask, has anybody had an experience where, for whatever reason, the owner felt more comfortable maybe like not knowing something about the performance than knowing, and then they needed to make adjustments because maybe it was less safe than they thought it would be? Or it's like, well, we wanted a factor of safety of 1.5, but now they've told us it's actually 1.5, right on the money, maybe 1.6 is better. Has anybody found that getting a lot of information has actually made the owner rethink and done more where maybe it isn't really necessary, but they might not have done more in the absence of data?
We had a project where we recommended grouting underneath the parking garage for shallow foundations because it was karst. And the owner and the contractor really wanted to do drill shafts because they didn't want to deal with the irregularities in the ground. So they had us do a boring in every column location. And they were so variable, they said, well, offset 5 feet and do an air track at every location so we can see how variable it is at each column. And by the time they got all that data, they said, there's no way we're putting drilled shafts in this job, and they had to go back to the grouting.
So you were right.
I love being right, but it was just funny to see the more data they got, the less comfortable they got with the direction they wanted to go.
With the over conservative overkill design, yeah.
Yeah, that would have been the easy answer. Just go ahead and put drilled shafts at every column, and there would have been all kinds of extras and changes.
Me as an owner, I think unknowns can be acceptable as long as you weigh that against the potential risks and the cost of them during construction. How much much is this going to cost me if it goes sideways? Is this a big problem? Is it a one foundation out of 50? Or, you know, it's a balance. It's a really delicate balance. The whole practice is.
Where the experience comes in.
Yeah.
That's why if you liked it neat and clean, you'd have been a structural engineer.
That's
If
right.
you can handle the unknowns, you're a geotech.
That includes your boots.
So we had a question in the morning session that might be appropriate for the afternoon. So how should the geotechnical data collection deal with shifting designs? They mentioned during the design build process, but it's probably appropriate for any construction. You know, how do we deal with change, I guess, is maybe what the question boils down to. If new information becomes available.
The first question I'd ask is, why didn't we think to look for this during design? But that's not really what you're asking, because this is for, you know, actual during construction.
Well, the first response I would have is, you know, if the structure location has shifted or changed in some manner, the engineer needs to re-look at it as if it was a brand new project and make the determination, do you have enough information to be able to do the engineering that you need? And if the answer is no, you have no choice but to go back and get the information. And I think there's an ample number of lawsuits that would support that.
Yeah, and this is where my comments earlier about having the contractual vehicle to clearly manage those changes becomes important.
Well, and I think there could be a number of projects, and it's probably, say, a strength that maybe design build or progressive design build has, where the designer is retained through the construction process, that if you have a project that is dynamic, say landslides or slope stability, and maybe things are materially different from when the original geotechnical information is taken to when you put, you know, shovels in the ground, that there is the ability to adapt, and you aren't, you know, trying to build something that maybe no longer is appropriate.
To Sarah's point, it's how much risk do you want to carry in your project?
But I think that also really highlights how important it is to keep geotechs involved throughout the project. If you kind of have the geotech at the beginning, I think it could be tempting to be like, oh, we don't need more information. We're just this little change, you know. If the geotech's part of the conversation throughout, then that can really help to streamline those things.
Does anyone have any experience with contract documents that specifically say that the design engineer needs to be present or do something during construction? You know, if, you know, because there's a lot of that language that, you know, says, like, if the design is significantly different, call us back. Just curious as to if anybody's seen something like that for.
I don't know that I've seen anything formal. I think that is our practice. The designers are usually pretty heavily involved with any changes that are made. We did always have a note on our plans for shallow foundations to have the subgrade inspected by a geotechnical engineer, and preferably someone from the department. And a lot of that evolved because of a learning process. You know, we're poking 2 holes in the ground that are this big, and then you get out and the excavation is or is not what you expect. I learned a tremendous amount about soil and behavior and rock types and how easy things are to excavate and what makes things easier for a contractor when it comes to digging a big hole in the ground.
Certainly from a Kiewit perspective, on a large project, we've started putting a resident geotechnical engineer as part of the construction staff to simply be able to go, you know, make those options, to be on site and to be able to do that. We'll do the same thing for us as a structural engineer for some of the temporary work, but we've learned that you just have to have the boots on the ground.
I've done the same thing with often with grouting projects and with sometimes with micropiles and also with vertical inclusions. I make sure that the designer provides inspection, because the field inspectors we have, they don't have experience with some of this not very common geotechnical construction. And I think it's really critical to have good logs, good documentation, and someone out in the field who can make decisions, so they're not calling back to the office, every day or so with, well, we encounter this, what do we do? Or the rock is not where we expect it, what do we do?
Cool. Heading back over to the poll questions for a moment. In your experience using GBRs as a means to minimize related issues during construction, about 2/3 of our responders have been involved with GBRs, and the most popular answer was that they have been effective, so 30% of the 66% that had used them. And second most popular answer was somewhat effective at 21%, and 6% effective, 3% not effective. We learned about Washington State mentioning in session 2 that as a means to minimize geotechnical related issues during construction, they provided contractual summaries of geotechnical conditions. 60% of our participants were unfamiliar with that, but of the 40% who did respond, about half and half between somewhat effective and effective, with 2 and 3% saying either very effective or not been effective. So it is good to see, on balance, that the majority of the respondents, when we're asking about things like CMGC, CMAR, baseline reporting, providing more information, that generally there is a positive response. They're at least effective, and more often somewhat effective or very effective, with the relative minority having them not be effective. And perhaps there are just some projects that are either so critical or so complicated that you could have tossed all the information out and you'd still have problems. I can imagine from my own experience, there are still going to be unknowns or things that crop up with time, schedule, administration, something that makes the project a challenge. Question 10 is one of the ones that we as the moderators, Ben and I, are interested in, talking about the AASHTO Provisional Standard of Practice for Digital Interchange, AASHTO PP 102. 65% of you said you were not familiar with it, so we are hopeful that today's session has made you familiar with that provisional standard. Talking about digs and data interchange, we suggest that if you do have access as an owner to the AASHTO standards and or a consultant or contractor, that you take a look at that. Right now it calls for digs XML to be used for the interchange of information, and different states have the ability to apply that in different ways. So some states will offer some assistance by saying, if the contractor provides information that's even digs ready, the State Department of Transportation may help with the actual conversion. So you can think of it as a stepping stone to help implement digs XML as an interchange standard of choice. So 2% of the respondents said they had specified it. 2%. I have to. Some of the answers got cut off as a requirement. Let's see. For all of our project work on at least one project was another 2%. At least one client or owner in a format consistent was 4%, and 27% said they were familiar with it but had not actually used it. So maybe when we have a presentation on a similar topic, we'll look for those numbers to increase. A quick note on that, the work that we're currently doing with digs XML and working with the Open Geospatial Consortium and Building Smart is allowing for the inclusion of digs XML within IFC and the AASHTO Foundation classes, along with other information into these digital twins. So you can think of different functional areas providing their information in languages and protocols, GeoSci ML, there's a trans XML that I'm not sure how much that is being used, but you can think of a lot of different groups providing their information in their own markup languages, and then all of that information being coalesced into the BIM environment. So we are right there meeting the needs of the industry foundation classes and the work that AASHTO is supporting with the DIGS XML standard. So
yeah, just a couple of points also. So, you know, the AASHTO standard references the existing ASTM and AASHTO standards for tests. And I would say 95% of what we do is DIGS ready. It's there. There are elements, you know, with geophysics and with blanking on a few of the other, it might be a performance test or two still there, but instrumentation, grouting, and a few other things that will be added into that. But sort of a parallel to this, Alan is actually the chair of the DIGS advisory committee with Geo Institute. And, you know, anytime if there's a need for, you know, use of a you know, certain measure, working with that group to get that in, to making sure that it's compatible with the DIG schema is what we recommend. In fact, that's what the PP 102 says, suggests to do. So be aware of there is an opportunity to interact with the DIGS group, and that group actually meets every the first Friday, Alan.
Yep, first Friday of every month.
And people are welcome to come to it.
Just send us an email, we'll get you on the list and we'll get the invite.
If you don't know Alan's email, you can email A-GaME@GEI Consultants. I'll get you to the right place.
Thanks.
Derek, do you want to ask the open-ended question
Magic
to
question?
wrap it
Yep.
up and see what
Yep.
people say? We can get a nice list of answers.
we will do that. So we're getting toward the end of our 2 hours. So I will prepare our panelists by saying you're going to have about 30 seconds for your one important topic of something that maybe you pitched already but would like everybody to know in the closing session. So that'll be our lightning round of closing statements when we get there. So be thinking of that one nugget you want to have your takeaway from today. But before that, in your opinion, what improvements would be the most beneficial to our current site characterization practices? So for our audience, please feel free to type your answers in the chat and we'll get to those as well. And if any of our panelists has a thought, who wants to begin? What would you do to improve site characterization moving forward? Alan.
I'll grab the first one, maybe it's easier. I think my suggestion would be is take those guidance documents, such as one boring per substructure, and recognize they're strictly minimums. You know, we need to be using engineering judgment and common sense and understanding the geology to put together a plan that answers the questions for the particular project, not just going by cookbook guidance. And
each Bolton seed would be proud. Minimums are minimums. Do better.
Yeah, I agree with Alan. I would rather have proposed 4 borings per substructure and somebody say, well, we drilled 2 and everything is really homogeneous. Do we have to drill the next 2 and make a decision then say we have to double our investigation or triple it because we didn't plan properly?
I would say that the need is really to get construction experience into the planning of the subsurface investigation, because often it's the designers that are looking for design issues. But I think the construction expertise into the planning of a geo program has been underutilized.
And I would even lobby that you need the geotechnical engineer needs to be involved at day one of the design project. The earlier that their involvement and guidance comes to the project, I think the better the outcome. You can't have situations where all of the stuff has been done and then they say, well, show me where you want to put your boring. That line of thinking is just wrong. You want the geotechnical engineer as part of the planning, helping to understand what the problems are and whether site facilities are in the right spot or not.
Well, as a corollary to that, some projects might need a geologist as well, because those two perspectives can work hand in hand in really difficult situations. And one doesn't know what the other knows.
One rarely knows that. Some of them do.
Some do.
And they're usually old.
Yeah, to Jim and Steve's point, that really leads to all these bigger projects, and maybe even some of the smaller ones really need a phased approach. You can't anticipate all the needs at the beginning of the job.
Well, and you'll find things that will tell you that, I need to go another direction and have the flexibility of saying, a pile supported embankment is a better answer than a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's an interesting point, Steve, and I think one that, as a profession, it wouldn't surprise me if we start seeing more of. I know a number of owners are interested in what I'll call de-inventorying structures. They're expensive to build. They're even more expensive to maintain over longer periods. So if you can take bridge decks out of surface and replace them with embankments, it has benefits for both sustainability and the fact that concrete and steel are very resource intensive materials to use. So I think that we'll be seeing more, I'll say, different geotechnical solutions brought to bear in the future. At least it wouldn't surprise me. Alan, I think you were a bit prescient, or you were reading the chat. One of our comments from Nick LaFrance, guidance on phasing of geotechnical investigations, including how to convince owners of the need and wisdom of a phased approach, is his contribution to thoughts about geotechs moving forward. Another comment from Grant, the more quality information you can get and the earlier you can get it, the better. And from Steve, perhaps not the entire project alignment matters and are best solved by one solution, better to recognize primary, secondary, or more solutions best fit variable problems versus the one size fits all approach, which seems to be a bit more of the norm. Thumbs up and concur to phased approaches.
Maybe to Steve Maxwell's comment, I'm not sure if he was saying this or not, but factoring risk into all these decision processes really should be part of the evaluation. We can put any foundation in anywhere, but they all come with certain risks. And how do you manage that along with the geotechnical data and the construction tools that are available?
But I would go say that on like a pile supported embankment, which I would consider a more geotechnical intensive approach to the project, that will demand a different pattern and number and type of investigation than you're going to drill for a bridge. So having that recognized that there are components that need more investigation should be considered.
Yeah, and speaking of the phased investigation, it's really important to know in what order to do things. We always went out and drilled our test borings, but recognizing that doing a geophysics investigation in a karst area is a lot more beneficial for planning your test borings than it is as a follow-up to them. So making sure you know all the things that are available to you and in what order to perform them in order to maximize the data that you're getting and not perform any aspect of that with overkill.
And bring the right tools to the geology. CPTs and a bunch of pinnacle karst may not be the best approach, but like you said, on 95 along the coastal plain, it's a great solution.
Yep.
Well, and for certain projects now, I think we have an enormous number of tools that perhaps we didn't have to bear in the past. You can think of groundwater resources. Many states have well drilling indexes where you're able to find groundwater gauging stations from nearby rivers with the USGS. If you're doing slope stability projects, a number of states now have local, regional, and statewide LiDAR mapping and hill shading that you, in just a few clicks of a buttons, you can say, it's like, oh, I know why that slope is failing. It's quite clear. It's in the middle of an even larger slope failure. And these tools are things that, we may not have even had, 5, 10, 15 years ago. So a lot of additional information out there for our use. And hopefully soon, even more geotechnical data through tools, DIGS, Geoceta, and others. All right, we're rapidly near the summing up. I'm going to go in rough order of the presentations this morning. So Jim, prepare yourself for your thoughtful question, followed by Steve, Alan, Ken, John, and Sarah. And then Ben and I will do a quick wrap up. I'd like to thank everybody who participated in the chat and in the day's polls. We had excellent response for folks participating in the poll. And so now our nuggets of wisdom. Jim, what final thought would you like to leave with folks? Or
Well, it's really impressive to see the level of which we can generate data today. And so the future's heading on a good track. How we use that and implement it is everything. And if somebody wants some momentum or reason to keep on the front edge of this stuff, remember that the best money I will ever make as a advisor expert is to come in and clean up your mess. So, you don't want to pay me for that.
There you go. Steve?
I think particularly for design build projects that the geotechnical baseline report process needs to be embraced and utilized in as many opportunities as you can. There's just not enough. Many of these things have not enough information. And the baseline report provides a way to kind of level the playing field and get everybody started on the same point. The option to that would be to embrace the construction manager approach, as to where the contractor is involved early and working with the design team. But design build practice, we've got to do a better job of providing geotechnical information for those teams.
Okay, Alan?
I think if you're not comfortable today generating, providing, using data in our daily workflow, you need to get ready for that. And I'd pay close attention to the rapidly expanding visualization and artificial intelligence, machine learning, whatever the analysis tools for using that data are really going to have an impact on our future.
Okay, Ken?
My big point here is kind of in line with our presentation, that there's a lot of data that can be generated on job sites, but interpreting that data takes some experience and needs to be done in context, that you can't just plug and play things from one job to the other, or even from one piece of equipment to the other. So that it's a great tool, but there's definitely some context and user experience that needs to go into that to making it effective.
Okay, John.
Sure, and similarly, to me, the best, most successful projects and data unlocking is with partnerships between a lot of different minds, often contractors and engineering teams, owners, but even just, it's always good to have other sets of eyes reviewing data.
And Sarah.
I'm gonna take this in a slightly different direction. Jim mentioned the future. Alan talked about the future, about what's coming. And I know that a really good geotechnical engineer usually has a really good mentor. And to anyone out there who's got young geotechs working for them, I really think, as important as it is to think about data and information and analysis and coming up with your parameters and the right foundation design, without an element of practical thinking and without good, healthy, strong relationships with those in construction, it's difficult to be successful. So in addition to being ready for what's coming and understanding how to use all the tools that you have, this is going to be your best. Knowing what works and doesn't work for contractors, knowing what's easy to build and not easy to build, and just deciding if you want to put shafts under an existing bridge. I could come up with 100 different examples. But the only way you're going to learn as a designer what's best for construction is to talk to them and go out to the jobs and get your boots muddy and ask questions over and over and over. Ask the people who have been around for 20, 30, 40 years. Ask the guys who are running the rigs and the machines and the excavators and the whatever the things are called that install vertical inclusions. And always make sure you take that back and think practically about whatever it is that you're going to recommend.
Good comment.
Yeah, I was going to say, those are some excellent parting thoughts. Get out to the job site and know what's going on. I'm with you there. I'll throw open the opportunity. Ben, Mary, do you have any nuggets of wisdom as closing thoughts this afternoon before I close this out?
I think this discussion was great, and I think there was a lot of great thoughts generated during both the presentations and this discussion. I could harp on a lot of things, but I think you guys really got the messages that are good ones to hear here.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't expect you to ask me that, so I was not mentally prepared. But I would really agree with what Sarah said. Is I feel like I've learned the most from being on construction sites and talking to the people who are building things, at least like as much as my engineering mentors. So, kind of not being afraid to just ask questions and get in there is how you figure out how it all works. So,
now that I had a few seconds to think about something. No, the one thought that you guys did bring up was phased investigations, and that goes back to the rational approach of approaching the design and planning of an investigation, and I think that is very fundamental to doing good site characterization. Going in with the objectives of the project, looking at the risks. What do I need to look at, and then sort of build your program from that. And I think it's intuitive that would be a phased investigation or approach. So I totally agree with that. You want me to take it, Derek?
Well, I think I've got it.
Okay.
So I would just like to take the opportunity to extend my appreciation to my colleagues Ben and Mary for their help on this webinar, as well as putting together the winter webinar series and our summer super sessions. We've had a great team working on this. Special thanks today to Jim Morrison with STV, Steve Say with Kiewit Construction, Alan Cadden with Schnabel Engineering Incorporated, Ken Niss and John Gill, both with Keller North America, and Sarah McInnes with Pennsylvania DOT. Our sessions would not be of the caliber and quality without contributions from folks like you. So we greatly appreciate you taking your time to both put together the presentations and to be with us in real time today. It is greatly appreciated. As we now move toward the final super session, this will be an owners only forum coming up in 1 week's time at 11 a.m. Eastern. So for those of you that are an owner, you'll be receiving more information on making it happen, improving site characterization for constructability and construction decisions. Owners will share ideas, best practices, and organizational needs with solutions and identify mutually beneficial action items. It will be a workshop style breakout session, so it'll have a different format. So come, be engaged, and we look forward to your opinions, your expertise, and contributions, and it should be a good session. So we'll appreciate our owner involvement there. And if you do have any additional information about the A-GaME, please feel free to contact Silas Nichols, our principal bridge engineer in Federal Highway Headquarters, myself, Derek Dozenbrock, or Ben Rivers. Both of us are with the Resource Center. We thank you for joining us today. And Ben, Mary, I guess back to you for any final thoughts.
Yeah, just thank you for joining us. Hope all of you owners can come, bring a rich group of A-GaME champions, not just geotechs, but hope our construction folk and project managers can join us too in that discussion, and really looking at making it happen, looking at our needs as owners, making all of what we heard this during these sessions come to fruit. So thank you very much, and looking forward for next week. And some of you already got the invite. We'll remind people again with that. But thank you very much. And thank you all speakers and panelists for great presentations and discussion.
Yeah, thank you everybody for
Thank you,
speaking.
Ben.
Thanks everyone so much for speaking and for your time. And I also want to just say, I think there was a question, how are we going to convince owners to do phased investigations? I feel like these sessions are making a huge impact on that, and everyone seems really open-minded and is really moving into the future in the right way. So,
and that is a topic for next week too.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.